Maybe Bridget has some.
Looking forward to this. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to day 2. So glad to see you here. I just have a couple of announcements before we get going with our program. And some of it is a little repetitive. As we said last time, we have live streaming going on, and so, be sure to get yourself out there to sign the waivers if you're one of the people who is participating in the panels or a plenary speaker, so that we got everything on the up and up, while we're broadcasting you to the world. Well, and if you're going to the conference dinner, as we mentioned last time, please do go ahead and make your choices out there. There are just a couple of people who haven't done that yet. Grad students, sign up for the raffle. So the book raffle. So those are my simple announcements about ongoing things. Also today, as you know, we're having an exciting program in many ways. Besides the general program, this morning we'll be having our African American Vernacular English and the evolutionary, oh my gosh, I can't pronounce it. Evolution. Let's see, let me get it right. Yeah.
Evolution or
Evolutionary or historical linguistics.
Well, evolutionary historical linguistics is what Sally Coco Mufwene will be speaking about, and that is pretty much the topic of the panel. And then we'll be having a roundtable in the afternoon, and Texas German and historical linguistics in the evening. So it's a big day for this all happening in this room. So welcoming all of you back. I'm going to now turn the floor over to Henning Anderson to begin with an introduction of Dr. Mufwene.
Thanks, Bridget. So it is my duty and honor to introduce Sally Coco Mufwene, Distinguished Professor of Linguistics at University of Chicago. Sally, as we call you, Sally is well known in the field as the preeminent Creolist, and probably doesn't need any introduction. But not everyone knows the details of his life that are so interesting, and I think I should mention a few of them. He got his first academic degree in 1973 at the State University of Zaire, where he got a licence en philosophie et lettres with a major in English. So already there he had 2 of the major languages needed for Creole studies. Though already before that he'd grown up in a community where his native language was Kiamsi, but other people spoke Lingala and Kitupa. So he had some acquaintance with foreign languages by the time he got his first academic degree. A Fulbright sent him to Chicago, where he got his PhD in '79 in linguistics. And then, looking for a job, he went to Jamaica, where he spent a year and a half and discovered the fascination and the difficulty of Creole studies. And that's where he wrote his first papers. And after that, he had another misfortune of going to Athens, Georgia, where he had an opportunity to study Gullah. And I guess by then his path was defined as a student of Creole languages. He has written on French Creoles and English Creoles, published scores of papers and several books that are well known. 2001, Ecology and Language Evolution. 2005, help me, Language Evolution, Contact, Competition and Change, and another collection of his papers in French in 2008. Throughout his career, he has dealt with every aspect of language in Creole studies, from phonology to vocabulary, and he has dealt with the Creole developments in the most diverse social surroundings, so that much of his work can be thought of as anthropological and historical. And so today, he is going to report on one of his recent developments. Actually, already in 1987, he asked the question in a paper whether one can study Creole languages without studying their history. In recent years, he's been developing a view of language development, which is sort of evolutionary, an application of the Darwinian or the Lamarckian theory of evolution to language change. And most recently, he has started the possibility of thinking productively about the actual phylogenetic evolution of language. And with that background, today's title is very attractive. And so we want to hear more about it. What is the difference? Does it make a difference whether we call it evolutionary or historical linguistics? Does a rose by other name, any other name, smell as sweet? I don't know. Anyway, you have the floor.
Okay. And thank you very much, Henning, for that very generous introduction. You really did your homework in digging into my background. And I'm touched because you are a veteran in the field. I'm just an intruder. And so it means a lot to me. Thank you all for coming here so early. It's challenging when you have traveled from a long distance, when you went on an excursion in the heat, and when you had a party after that. I've been through that. I know what it is like, and I'm very grateful that you are here. And I'm very grateful to the organizers for including me among the plenary speakers at this conference. I set up a challenge for myself because over the past few years, I came across the term evolutionary linguistics as used by Minette and Wang 2005 and Croft 2008, and I found it particularly consistent with the kind of work that I have been doing in developing an ecological approach to language evolution. I had been using the term language evolution, but never thought of calling the kind of research I've been doing evolutionary linguistics. And the term has been applied, has been used in reference to several things: the phylogenetic emergence of language, and McMahon 2012 used the term strictly in that sense, and are opposed to extrapolating it beyond the phylogenetic the study of the phylogenetic emergence of language. But the rest of us are quite interested on the model of evolutionary biology itself, in applying it to change associated with unfaithful transmission or reproduction. That's what evolution is. And we can apply it to structural change the way that historical linguistics has done traditionally, but we can also apply it to change in the vitality of a language in the same way that biologists are interested in endangered species and so forth. And we can also apply it to matters of speciation, call it diversification if you want, where we notice the emergence of new varieties, and I'll be more explicit about that. And evolutionary linguistics is not intended to obliterate differences between the study of the phylogenetic emergence of language, genetic linguistics, or historical dialectology, genetic creolistics, which I've been doing, historical linguistics in the narrow sense, and the study of language vitality. Everybody can keep doing their business. But it is a convenient umbrella term that seeks to foster a dialogue between these different research areas despite their different foci. So the question is, how can we inform each other what issues or questions addressed in one research area that should interest those working in another? And I'm especially concerned with the role of migrations and contact and the ensuing population structure in actuating language spread, language change, language speciation, and language shift, as well as in favoring some languages over others. And the position I adopt is all this has been part of the history of mankind since the exodus out of Africa, in one way or another. And I want to place great emphasis on the actuation of change. I'm sure that Bill and Gillian and other people talking about new directions of historical linguistics will be talking about this. And we all remember Weinreich, Labov, and Herzog about the actuation. And April McMahon, I think, published in 2003, 2004, at least focus on that too. And more attention should also be given on the ecology of a language, and that's where I think we can find answers on the actuation of change. From a phylogenetic perspective, my challenge has been to define the ecology that matters. And that's where I learned to dissociate the anatomy of the speaker and the mind of the speaker from language. And that's really where the primary ecologies of any language lie, before we can invoke what I have identified as indirect external ecology, which we find in the emergent population structure. And population structure is something that needs to be unpacked, where a population is segregated or integrated, and what is the division of power in the population, who makes concessions to whom, who accommodates whom, and so forth, and what are the attitudes that people develop toward each other, and these are all factors that bear on the evolution of language. And from a historical perspective, more attention should be paid to population structure, including economic systems and practices or political organizations that influence social organizations. And in my work, these are the kinds of things that have made a significant difference. So where you have an economic system that doesn't favor the domination of a majority population and the minoritization of that population, language evolves in one way. And where you subjugate a large population and then impose segregation, and you basically foster divergence between the emergent varieties, and this is what we find in the case of Creoles. But there are other interesting cases that I will return to that also invoke population, such as the significance of population structure. And as biologists have always said, I learned it especially from Stephen Jay Gould, the ecology rolls the dice. And here we have a lot of lessons to learn from Creoles, and I will focus on Creoles because traditionally, as I say in my 2001 book, Creolistics has been made to look like a consumer discipline. Everything is all right in other disciplines. Creoles are exceptional, and we just have to find out why they are exceptional. I want to reverse the table. I think Creoles are reminding us of everything that we forgot to do, that we forgot to pay attention to. And maybe we should reopen the books on a number of things. I know it's very daring, but you can shoot me down after. More attention should be paid to the cascade of ecological determinants that bear on language evolution. So typically, if you do Creoles, you have to pay attention to the kind of climate where people relocated, the kind of soil where they're relocated, because these determine the kinds of economic systems that would develop, and the kinds of economic systems that develop would generate particular population structures. And you find differences between the colonization of Virginia that depended on tobacco cultivation and the colonization of coastal South Carolina and Georgia that thrive on sugarcane cultivation. And the population structures are not the same. Segregation was not instituted at the same time, and the linguistic consequences are different. And there's the relevance of variation in styles of colonization. We are very much interested now in language endangerment, but everybody should know that what happened in settlement colonies has not been happening in former exploitation colonies, and the stories are just different. In former exploitation colonies, we are not worried about the European languages taking over for particular reasons, because segregation was the norm from the beginning, and the majority of the populations have been disenfranchised, and poverty has sustained the minority languages, whereas in settlement colonies, the story is quite different. And the significance of the correlation between natural ecology of a colony and the kind of economic system it enables, I already talked about that. But an important factor not to forget is the periodization. When did things change? And in the case of Creoles, we have learned to make the distinction between the homestead phase, the first 15 to 50 years, depending on the colony, when the slaves were the minority, when there was discrimination but no residential segregation, because it was pointless if everybody lived in what Jodanson describes as conditions de la Robinsonade, abject poverty, deprivation, material deprivation. And as Peter Wood also suggests in his Black Majority, the whites didn't know the tropical ecologies, and it would have been foolish of them to alienate the people that were going to help them adapt to the tropical ecology. And there are consequences from this, okay. And when we deal with the phylogenetic aspect of language, well, you first have to check the representation at the bottom. I want to test you on one thing. Is there any anomaly in that representation of human evolution? The world is whitening. Prejudice from the 19th century. It doesn't matter whether you color it or not when you pay attention. The phenotypical features go from the ape to the white guy, the European. And it's very sexist. Anyway. But the bottom line here is that when you speculate on when language has emerged, you have to focus on the particular kind of mind that could have co-opted a particular kind of body to produce the kinds of languages that we speak, to the point where we can say the mind is always in gear, because when the anatomy fails, but the mind is ready, the mind will produce something different. And that we know, for instance, from sign language we have to ask ourselves from a technological point of view, why have we focused? I mean, why are spoken languages the dominant form of communication? Okay, and we usually think of features such as speaking in the dark and so forth, but we seldom think of population structure, with the deaf people usually being in the very small minority and being overwhelmed by the majority that overlook whatever they can produce. So we have no sense of how many sign languages have evolved in the history of mankind. And now when we think of the Bedouin population, and they represent a significant proportion of the population, and can put the speakers under pressure to learn signing too, and we realize that things could have evolved differently. And we don't think of possibilities where it could have been dangerous to just speak underwater and you would drown. And signing would have been more advantageous. Or being near a predator. If you speak, you give away your location. So you balance things out, and you really cannot approach the subject matter of the immersions, phylogenetic immersions of language, without paying attention to the particular ecological factors that bore on the choices that our species made throughout our long trajectory. And then when we get to the history part, then, you know, the anatomy, the mind, they are a given. Now we have to pay attention to things that influence the mind. And that's where population structure kicks in. What happened when the Germanic populations crossed the Channel and went and colonized England? What kind of population structure made it so that it's hard to find Celtic influence on English, and you have to wait until the colonization. Well, part of it, the emergence of Scots English. But what people have been talking the most about is Irish English, and what you discover is that Ireland was really being colonized on the settlement style, in the settlement style, just when the colonies of the New World were colonized in the settlement style. That English was being taken more seriously by the people in Ireland just about the time that people in the settlement colonies had to deal with the arrival of English too, and so forth. And what spread Irish and in English in Ireland isn't so much the school system or the boarding school, but the textile industry, which made English significant for somebody to earn the living, to leave the rural areas and go to the centers where the textile industry was developing. And that's the real economic pressure that made a lot of difference. And that is what contributed to the spread of substrate influence in Irish English, because the school system was aimed at repressing substrate influence and was unsuccessful and things like that. And so I think I have to switch off. Okay. So, and then you take the case of English as expressed around the world, and the darker parts are where English is spoken as mother tongue. And the lighter part, that's where English is an official language, but spoken only by a minority of the population. And you wonder what the difference is. And an important difference is exploitation, colonization versus settlement colonization. Settlement colonization has no respect for indigenous cultures. Or I don't know where it has no respect, but it is so assimilationist and oppressive at the same time. Not that exploitation, colonization was not oppressive, it was also disdainful. But it imposed strict segregation that was harder to cross. But it also imposed a system of buffer between the majority of the colonized people and the colonizers and a class of auxiliaries that were well trained in speaking the European language, but they made the European language useless, unneeded for the people that had to rely either on traditional subsistence economy or on blue-collar work, which operates in the indigenous languages. So the language for work is not the European languages for the majority of the people. And for the longest, this is a part of exploitation, colonization that has received very little attention, colonization through interpreters, all the way to the 20th century. And later on, I'm going to dispute the claim that pidgins emerged early in the contacts between Europeans and non-Europeans, between the trade. The nature of the trade was too important financially to operate in a pidgin. I think that pidgins may have developed later than Creoles. Sorry to pull the rug from under your feet. And so, did Creoles really evolve differently from colonial non-Creole European language varieties, or are Creoles simply disavowed new Indo-European language varieties? It's something that we have to think over if we admit substrate influence in the European languages that are not Creoles and so forth. The difference between Creoles and non-Creoles becomes thinner and thinner and less likely to be found in the structural features, more likely to be found in the specific population structures that generated them and so forth. I'm not saying that we should do away with the term Creole. I'm not saying that we shouldn't study Creoles as a special group of languages. Actually, Creolistics has given me interesting subversive ideas, hypotheses, and I find that very useful. Nobody should kill the field of Creole studies, and not me especially. Okay. And the Creoles here on this map are represented by the small dots. Blue, that's for French Creoles, red is supposed to be English Creoles, and so forth. And there we have the distribution of Creoles around the world, more or less. The map is not so accurate. This, I don't have a mouse here. So the big circle around the Caribbean and so forth should actually be something more oval, going all the way to Suriname. But that's the idea. And that big circle actually has given us our heuristic prototypes of Creoles, in other words, the varieties that we are the best informed by and that can inform our research questions in comparison to other situations. And the only place I know where a Creole and a pidgin emerge is Hawaii. But when you pay attention to Hawaii, Creole emerged in the city, unlike everywhere else, and pidgin on the plantations, unlike everywhere else. They emerged concurrently, and this is quite interesting. And the colonization of Hawaii by the United States started after the abolition of slavery and was based on contract labor. And the people in Hawaii were not mixed like on the plantations where Creoles developed, which means we could also be asking questions whether we should be calling the variety a Creole. And when you check this, I stumbled on this evidence by mistake, by accident, but not by mistake for those, by accident, was eating my lunch and I look at the placemat and then it said, it was in an old plantation, Japanese house, Chinese house, and Korean house and so forth. And Hawaii is actually one of those places where the Japanese have remained Japanese, the Chinese have remained Chinese, and so forth. You are not going to find any plantation in the Caribbean or in the Indian Ocean where the Igbos have remained the Igbos, the Yorubas, and so forth. And the mix that took place in the Caribbean and in the Indian Ocean is something that you don't find in Hawaii and so forth. And so even Creoles, you have to be very careful about being uniformitarian to the extreme and thinking that the same conditions obtained everywhere. And that's something that has been overlooked in history. And this is what informs my approach today. And there's the significance of periodization in language shift, and for instance, African Americans versus European Americans. Did it ever cross your mind that the Africans anglicized before continental Europeans? And because of that, the Africans had more opportunity to influence the evolution of English in some parts of the United States than continental Europeans, because for continental Europeans, if George Sammons and other people that have been studying language shift among Europeans are correct, they shifted to English like me. English is my vernacular today, and here my daughter is born, and then she tells me, maybe in Africa you say it that way. Here in America we say it this way. And children were important filters in reducing the kind of influence that continental Europeans could have exerted on the emergence of, on the evolution of American English. After all, people of English descent represent at best 20% of the white American population. And we know that the Germans speak English with an accent, the French speak English with an accent. It's not just us Africans speaking English with an accent. Therefore, American English would have been much more different than it is. And periodization helps us sort things out and make sense of that kind of history. So early language shift for Africans on coastal South Carolina and Georgia versus Virginia and the cotton plantations. The fact that this has been suggested by Edgar Schneider and Guy Bailey, that the Jim Crow laws are passed after the abolition of slavery. And I think the first laws were passed in 1877 in Kansas. And then after that, the white indentured servants who had constituted 50 to 75% of the white population in the South have the separate evolution versus the former slaves. And that's the beginning of the divergence between white American English and African American English. But it is also the beginning of the confusion for the rest of us that are not familiar with the South, because as people say, if you don't see the speaker, you don't really know who is speaking if you are not a local. And this is not a new thing, because when I did field work on Gullah, people would tell me on Edisto Island, people speak differently from us here on Guatemala Island, or from us here on Jones Island, and so forth. And like, listen very carefully, I cannot tell the difference, but the locals know. And these are the subtle things that we have to pay attention to. And the history is that to tell us why the natives think that they speak different from each other, but we outsiders may be confused about all this. But, and because of that, African American English is just different from Gullah. The difficult thing is really the cutoff line. My practical cutoff line is Interstate 95, which was built along the marshes to separate the marshes. It was less expensive to build the interstate that way. And when you drive on the interstate, depending on your luck, you can find some Gullah on the left side of the interstate, but you are more likely to find it on the right side of the interstate because that's where the rice fields were. And on the left side, the blacks were in the minority, and cotton plantations, agriculture hadn't quite developed yet in the early stages. And again, Guy Bailey has said a lot about the introduction of the cotton gin and so forth, and what difference it made for the development of Southern economy and so forth, and how African American English would emerge as a separate variety. But then you take the great migration from the south to the north, and you can understand why Northerners would see a variety that was no more than Southern English as Black English. And here comes the linguist trapped in social history, in local politics. And we have African American English as a separate breed of its own. But then you put things in perspective. There are other varieties similar to African American English that could have received as much attention that we have, but they haven't. So, but the thing here is the significance of national settlements with the English, within the English colonies and language maintenance until late after the American Revolution, and the competition between economic systems and the prevalence of the Anglo-economic and political system as an evolutionary attractor. Attractor here is in complexity theory, what changes the evolutionary trajectory of things. And the miracle of the survival of French despite the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana Purchase for me is another big attractor that made English, that helped English become a world language. Two major attractors: the fact that the United States could now expand from the East Coast to the West Coast and become an important demographic power, and the colonization of India that played a very important role in the expansion of the British Empire. And for whoever wants to trade with the Anglophone world, India and the United States, these are terrific powers. And France lost that opportunity, especially also with the unsuccessful colonization of Indochina that was supposed to be the counterpart of India for French. Okay. And the scenario of European migrations to the colonies and the ensuing population structure help us ask a number of interesting questions about language speciation and language vitality. Excuse me. I have to shift to mode B now. I'm sorry, I've been going backward here. Yeah. When did Gala emerge and when did African American English emerge? Is there any reason for assuming that African American English emerged before Gala? But Virginia was colonized long before South Carolina was. And the first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1617, and the first Africans arrived in South Carolina in 1670. And the large plantations in South Carolina don't start until after 1720. And there is every reason to believe that the guys in coastal Virginia just crossed their arms and waited for the people speaking Gala to develop something. Or is there a bias that if you are African, you must start with the most divergent variety, even if you live in a homestead, and even if your children are expected to speak like the children of the white Creole children. So there's something to think about. Were there once European national varieties of English? The answer is yes, we know that. And why have Gala and African American English have survived, but most of the other varieties have not population structure? The white American population, I think before you speak of the Germans, or the Italians, and so forth, and at some point in history, American cities are restructured. It's the white neighborhood and no longer the German neighborhood, the Italian neighborhood, and so forth. And then you have an African American neighborhood. And then you have a Latino, Hispanic neighborhood, and so forth. The patterns of segregation shift, but the boundaries between Italian English, German English, and so forth collapse. But African American English can still thrive. And Gala is segregated, the area where Gala is spoken is segregated geographically. And of course, people speak of land development and so forth, but the people that go and live in these developments, if you visit the territory, there is usually a highway that neatly separates the white in-migrants neighborhoods from the, let's call them the more indigenous neighborhood, and they meet in the grocery store, which is on the highway. How many of you stop to talk to strangers in the grocery store? And there is a dispensary or a hospital on the highway too. And the churches are separate. People don't go to the same churches. So, and the church is an important place for socialization. So you can see why, yes, Gala isn't about to die yet. But then why has Amish English survived? So we want to understand things about Gala, we should be paying attention to Amish English too. Where different restructuring mechanisms and conditioning factors involved in the emergence of these varieties. If shift is a factor, the Amish are an interesting population because they shifted from German to English, and they speak a different kind of English from many other white Americans that have been more integrated. What's the story? And should we really develop a different kind of approach to African American English than to Amish English? Why is the loss of Native American languages more obvious now than in the 18th century? Not the impact of the following factors. Germs killed a large proportion of Native Americans, germs from the old world. And if Native American languages were endangered, they were endangered then, and I'm sure many of them died at that time, especially from the genocide committed by the Spaniard colonies in the Caribbean and Central America. And the encroachment of European immigrants on Native American reservations in the 19th century, and the wave of migrations and language contacts that these encroachments triggered on Native Americans. So Native Americans coming in contact with each other and being regrouped, which are the weaker populations that lost their languages to more important populations. The lure of the new socioeconomic now, the lure of the new socioeconomic world order since the 20th century. And I think that one of the biggest mistakes in the literature on language endangerment is not paying attention to why European Americans from continental Europe have also lost their languages and under what conditions, and whether those conditions have something to do with why Native Americans are really losing their languages now, not from germs that killed them, not from genocide, but from the lure of the new socioeconomic world order. Instead of telling us that Native Americans are losing pride in their heritage, I can't believe it. I came up from a very poor background, and I never thought that I should be embarrassed by that, although I have struggled all my life to better my socioeconomic conditions. It's a matter of practicality, and prestige has very little to do with it when you pay attention to the varieties that people have been shifting to. They have not been the most prestigious varieties either, just vernacular varieties. What is going to get you a job in a factory? You don't need standard English for that. Okay. And language shift and the emergence of Creoles, the pressure for language shift occurred quite early among the enslaved Africans during the homestead phase. And I think that African languages died, thank you, not because the masters didn't want the Africans to speak their languages, but because of the founder effect. By the way, Gillian Sankoff had thought of it as a principle of first settlement, something like that. So the founder effect, you come to a new place, you model yourself of those that have survived under those conditions, and you learn to speak like them. And I think that the pressure was coming from the slaves that had occurred earlier, and the effect continued. And I think because of the continuous supply of slaves, African languages could still be heard on the plantations and spoken until after the abolition of the slave trade. And an important difference is that unlike for Europeans whose, for whom the volume of immigration really became more intense in the 19th century, there was interruption in the supply of Africans. After the abolition of the slave trade and the few clandestine slaves that were brought to the United States, according to Guy Bailey, we have to wait until after the time of independence of African countries in the 1960s before you could see Africans emigrate again, like me, and not living with African Americans, but blending with other people, and unable to exert any more influence on the evolution of African American English. But because they never reached the critical mass to form their own separate communities, you are not going to find a community of people that are developing Ghanaian American English or Nigerian American English, although you can identify such varieties, but as referring to the origins, the country of origin of the immigrants. And the pressure may have been similar among the indentured slaves. That's the forgotten part of the cruel American beginnings with the indentured servants interacting the most regularly with the slaves, and many of them having to shift their languages too. Think of the Irish indentured servants who probably didn't speak English when they left Ireland and had to learn English next to the slaves. And this is just another aspect of the emergence of Creoles that we forget, that you find situations similar to me learning English from Belgian professors in the Congo. I came across two of them and they didn't want to speak to me in English anymore. We spoke French. They know what happened. But is it just the Africans that restructured the European language? Or is it also the indentured servants that were with them? And a good example, you find it in Suriname. Suriname was traded against the state of New York, and the Dutch kept English as the lingua franca for interaction with the slaves. It became the vernacular for the slaves. And the Dutch were not better learners of English, and English was not their mother tongue and so forth, and these features that we can relate to Dutch and so forth are evidence that they had a role to play in the kind of Creoles that develop in Suriname. Why don't we pay attention to these kinds of things when we study the emergence of Creoles? So this history tells us a great deal about the power of economic system in driving language shift and the plight of most disenfranchised economically, and the people that tend to lose their languages first are those that are economically disenfranchised, disempowered, but in an assimilationist structure, because when you go to Africa, it's another story. The people that are economically the weakest are also kept on the margins of the population. There is the few, the lucky few, happy few that benefit from the new modern economic structure, and this kind of disenfranchisement helps the disenfranchised keep their languages, whereas in an assimilationist system, like in former settlement colonies, the history is different. But then there too, we learn a whole lot about population structure in the United States in reversing the role. Why was it the free immigrant Europeans that shifted to English first and not Native Americans, and why are Native Americans the last to jump on the bandwagon? And when they do so, we come up with different kinds of interpretations. I had planned a long story that I can unfortunately not finish. But the one thing that I want to highlight is there were some Native Americans that shifted early to English, and that's the case of the Lambi population. It's Hazen, I can't remember his name, work with Wolfram, talks about the Lambi population, and they, Kirk Hazen, and they shifted to English. Other Native Americans didn't. We should understand why they did, other Native Americans didn't. What role did they play in facilitating European colonization? But at the same time, if you say you lose your language and you lose your culture, they have remained Native American. They have not assimilated culturally to the white American population. And then the Amish have kept the variety of English, but then Pennsylvania Dutch, no shift, no integration, no assimilation to the new socioeconomic world order. There are a lot of things going on in there. So we can speculate that widespread language shift among Hispanic Americans and immigrants is a matter of time, while residential segregation may force a Hispanic English comparable to AVE under similar economic pressures. But any wise man that does sexist, any wise person, any wise person that does evolution should know better than to speculate about the future. According to Stephen Jay Gould, evolutionary science looks behind in the past and not in the future. For convenience reason, I'm going to stop here and just forgo the rest of the story that I was going to tell you. Thank you very much for your attention.
There's time for questions.
Yeah. If anywhere I can scroll.
Thank you. Would you agree that there is a lot of politics involved? I mean, obviously, when you talk about colonization, there are some clear-cut cases of what colonization is in some parts of the world. But this is controversial, and I'm thinking of the Middle East, for instance, where in Palestine in particular, Hebrew has emerged as what I would call a colonizing language. Many other people would dispute that. But so when we talk about, because often when we talk about colonization, we're talking about English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch. That's pretty much the list, right? And in any case, it's European languages. But what about non-European languages that colonize? And are we free to interpret such cases as colonization, even though they are arguably controversial?
Yeah. Can somebody help me navigate here, because I cannot scroll down? There is a map I want to project. Okay. Yes, I was going to get to that typology of colonization styles. I started with a preliminary one of trade colonization, settlement colonization, and exploitation colonization.
Can you speak into the microphone?
Oh, yes. Where do you want to go? I want to go to a map below. Keep going. Here. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I started with a typology of distinguishing between settlement colonization, trade colonization, and exploitation colonization. And when I look back and focus on the colonization of Europe by and North Africa by Rome, it turned out that the typology doesn't quite apply because Rome colonized Europe in a style halfway between settlement and exploitation. And the proof of it lies in the fact that when Rome was threatened by the Vandals, the Romans returned to Rome and abandoned the provinces, which is contrary to white Americans asking for independence from the UK because they wanted to protect their own interests locally. But Jürgen, now I don't know his last name, but there's a German guy. He has come up with a more sophisticated typology in a little book titled Colonialism, where he makes finer distinctions. And the value of that actually is that when you compare like North America with Latin America, you find out that even settlement colonization was not applied in a uniform way. And you find differences too, and that is reflected by the way that Portuguese and Spanish have evolved there, but also in the impact on Native American languages. And this map here represents the colonization of the southern part, not southern part, the part of Africa from the equatorial forest all the way to the southern tip of Africa by the Bantu population since about 3,000 years ago. And they displaced the populations on the left designated as Pygmies and Khoisan people, took a lot of land from them and drove the Pygmy languages to extinction and a large proportion of the Khoisan languages to extinction too. So in this, even the technologies that are compared must be relativized. And in the Middle East, it's another story, but the Middle East, that's more complex in the present because of the role of politics to the hostilities and stuff. So I'm not going to get into that. I'm sorry.
That's the problem.
Yes. Yes. Brian Joseph.
Thank you, Sally, for a fascinating talk, extremely interesting and very provocative, as I would have expected. As Donald Trump Jr. would say, I love it. But let me take exception to one small terminological part of your presentation. When you referred to the European national varieties in the U.S., and I would take issue with the adjective national, because I mean, German in the U.S. is not just from Germany. Italian in the U.S. is from Sicily, which is a very different kind of thing from Italian and so forth. So I understand why you have to talk in those terms, but I don't know what a better characterization would be, but I just wanted to mention that.
I stand corrected. I struggle with the terminology and just chose it as a matter of convenience.
Yeah, I figured. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think,
That's somebody.
oh, there is another one.
Okay, yeah, I just had one question about the shift of Native American languages, not having anything to do with notions of prestige. So you mentioned that, Native American languages, at least today, are probably shifting for economic reasons, but it seems that, with the reservation system, that there isn't that interaction with the new socioeconomic world order. So I guess, why in a situation where they're not necessarily interacting in that economic sphere, would the languages be shifting in that situation?
Well, we have Native Americans here. My understanding is that languages, where the Native American languages are still surviving, it's on the reservation and not outside the reservation. And something that is happening on the reservation is that people are developing casinos as a new form of money-making industry. But here is something that Nicholas Osler highlights, the buying power of the client. And so the casinos on the reservations don't have the liberty of developing the business in a Native American language because it wouldn't make them any money. And even if they made it a condition for finding employment there, it would just help the few that find employment, but if there are no customers, you cannot sustain the employment. So they are in a predicament where the casinos are actually having the opposite effect of spreading English. And the other cases I know are, now you can receive television on the reservation. And so there is all this attraction about the world out there. And for the little that I have read, the young people that are attracted to life outside the reservation are developing an interest in this. But also if you have members of the reservation that have become successful outside the reservation, they become part of the motivation why you have to shift languages. I tell people that a whole lot of people are learning English around the world because of people like me. Because you go to the Congo and they tell you, Mufwene learned English and he's now a professor in the United States. So there's a lot of motivation there. So it's a complicated situation.
We have gotten a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much, Tali.
Thank you.
The whole linguistic world is going down the drain. I'm dangerous.
Oh, yeah. But there is still, it's terrible. And no casinos in anyone.
They want to introduce Dave from grade 1 in the school, English from grade 1 in the schools. Because otherwise the kids don't have a good pronunciation. Can you think of that? I mean, that's not economic. That's, well, at the university, my students, when I taught in Denver, they wanted to have courses in English. Because we evidently will command English.
But also because the market for
Yeah, market in
so narrow, people want to go
That is
outside.
a wonderful aspect of field studies, the economic aspect. It's not this interpersonal thing. It's the personal. That's why it's, we'll live it. All right. That was a good talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I didn't get to the part where we were going to fight each other because
Maybe we can do it tomorrow instead of my talk.
I'm a master's student at University of New Mexico. I was wondering if you could sign my copy.
This is just the AV release form since we're going to take a streaming session. You can do it afterwards, whichever you want. Oh, thanks, sir. Thank you. At what time are you presenting? Okay, and you're gonna use your computer? Okay, so is it possible for us to put on
I'm gone. I just wanted to see whether it works. It does, so that's all.
Well, so in order for us to live stream with your computer, we just have to put something on it.
Okay.
So that we can access it. Is that okay? Oh no, and is it okay if I disable your Wi-Fi until you present, and then you can switch back, to the other one? You can still use internet. Did it just die?
No, I just turned it off because we'll have to power.
Okay.
Plug it in when I start. There will be a moment of transition.
Well, so we want to prepare beforehand.
Oh, so are you hooked? You're not hooked up yet then?
I'm fine, yeah. No.
So you're going to use your own, or you're going to
I'm
load
going
it
to use
here?
my own when I'm up. And then just unplug this one here and use mine.
You want to go ahead and do that now?
I did. I mean,
Oh,
somebody,
okay.
somebody will need another one, I suppose, right? I just tried it out and it works easily, so
Okay.
that's...
Okay, all right.
So is it possible to put it on now, or
So I
now
have
do that? So
until
then we can.
9:55.
Well, can you open it?
Good morning. We're starting we're a little late, but if you guys can come on back in for the first panel, in this room at least, for the day. Okay. Sorry, I know I have timekeepers, but then I got to keep time myself. So good morning to everyone. Thank you for joining us for this first panel on African American language and the ecology of language change. My name is Sanja Lanehart. I am the Brackenridge Endowed Chair of Literature and the Humanities here at the University of Texas in San Antonio, and I am the organizer and sponsor for this panel. I'm glad that I love this first talk that we had to set us off, and you'll get a chance to hear from Sally Coco once more as he is our discussant. So I'm just the introducer, and I'm going to give some general remarks. We have 3 papers that are part of this panel, and then Sally Coco will be our discussant. And each of the papers, as you know, will be 20 minutes with 5 minutes for questions, and we have a coffee break right in the middle after our first paper. So just to tell you a little bit about me and about this panel, and I didn't prepare any slides, so you don't have to worry about that. But I do have a title that, in listening to Sally, it made me think of this, because this is exactly how this sort of panel formed, and sort of got me into African American language. So I'm calling it What, How, Why, and Who in Context. So I am a native Texan. Which means I was born here, because you can only be native Texan if you were born here, no transplants. So I'm a native Texan. I was born in Houston. Even though all of my family is from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and surrounding Baton Rouge, my parents, for some reason, wanted me to be born in Texas, and it occurred during what apparently was some sort of migration, because all of these people from Louisiana, from various parts of Louisiana, they came to the Houston area, and then some went on to further west and went to California. So all of my parents' friends were from Louisiana in some respect. They all lived together, they all moved around the city together, and that was sort of my context growing up. And when I got interested in African American language, it was this what question, like, what is this, right? So when I went to college at the University of Texas at Austin, I was asking things like, well, why do black people say be all the time, right? Why are there these differences? And so very simple, right? And I think that's how we sort of get interested in most things, right? We just want to know the what is this thing. And then when we think about the what is this thing, Then we sort of move to the how. Well, how does this work, right? So you notice that there are some differences. Well, how are these differences sort of comparing to other places? Like, so yes, I know black people do this, but then why do these other people do this? Or I'm now hearing people doing these different things, and right, what are those comparisons? And for me, when I got to that point, that was when I became interested in the history of the English language. And I started out as a medievalist. So when I went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, I did medieval studies for my master's degree, and I was doing Old English and Middle English. And the whole idea of that was to try to figure out how did we get from that space to then this thing we call African American language and how black people speak in this particular context. And so I did all of these grammar studies and, read all these grammar books from the 18th century, et cetera, and which was not really helpful because all it did was tell me that people just made these things up, right? So, we have these rules based upon Latin and, and it's like, I don't know, how did you get from A to B then, right? Because it was just what somebody felt like saying. And that's what all of this review of these grammar books taught me. That was everybody was very self-centered and interested in their own particular thing and preservation for their own particular styles and what have you, and really had nothing to do with anything. So then that was my, just language is arbitrary phase, right? And that's how I got through my how thing. But then that also within the context of talking about history of the English language, it's like, all of this is muddied, so then is it a Creole or is it a dialect, right? Because you're like, it's similar here and it's got this particular there. And so thinking about it in that particular way, it wasn't a question that I ever answered because before I could think about deciding that I wanted to be sort of this Creolist perspective or this Anglicist sort of dialectology perspective, although I will say probably in undergrad I was thinking more along the lines of dialectology because that's what I was interested in variation, but never really committed to any of that, just still sort of going through the what is this, how is this, and trying to figure it out. But in more, I think we start in sort of these really simple questions like that, right? The more you learn, I think the more you're saying you develop into more complex questions. And so for then it became, why do I have to say that it's either one? And this is around the time when I was still doing history of the English language, was teaching history of the English language, and came across C. Millward's book on the history of the English language. And it was the first place that I had seen that there was this discussion about African American language, or not African American language, but English in terms of it being a Creole. Why wouldn't we call it a Creole, right? So I had some discussions with Sally about this. And as a matter of fact, he was the one who, I think we were talking about the Millward book, so with Sally Coco Mafwani. And I started really questioning this, and this is something we talked about in my classes. What is it then? Why wouldn't other things be Creole? So you can tell why I was most really interested in Sally's talk, because he addresses part of this in his topic, but it really aligned up with years ago these conversations that I had with him. And I began to sort of then move into a different phase of questioning, right? It's like then it became a why thing. Why do we call it this and why do we think of it as this, given all of these things that we know? And that sort of then sort of made me think about issues of subjectivities. So at this point, I had sort of started shifting from history of the English language. I moved much more specifically into language and linguistics, and looking at variation more broadly, not just for African American language, or not just with it's specific to that community, but within a community, within a context, in a history. So a sociocultural and historical context, which is how I did my first book, that was greatly in part to actually Sally Coco and another scholar, Michelle Foster, at the time, who said, you should do this conference and you should ask these questions. And so all of the chapters are based on questions that I asked, and Guy Bailey answered questions for me, and Tricia Sucre-Avila answered questions for me, and Edgar was there. I mean, like, all of these things, because that's where we're still at, right? I need to know these things. But even looking back on that, it seems like to some extent, right, okay, that's the beginning of going from a simple question to a more complex question. We're still not there. But then sort of trying to figure out the idea of subjectivities, like who we are in terms of how we arrive at what it is that we do, right? So we have differences in our sociocultural and historical context, and so we ask questions that are relevant to that make sense to us from that particular perspective, right? We don't all ask the same questions, and we also don't go about answering those questions in the same way because of those subjectivities. And so I started looking in that, and that, of course, then goes to where Sally's talking about, well, then there were colonizers and the colonized, right? We all grew up in linguistics with the people in charge or who has the army and, the people who have the army and the navy, right? So there's somebody in charge, right? And there's somebody who's being subjugated or somebody who's being used in particular sorts of ways. Well, then I also got introduced to Freire, and then I started realizing that the colonized or the oppressed become the oppressors too. And so that led to some really interesting things in thinking about this. But the whole point is, it's all leading into this, what I've sort of much more within the last few years of my career, and sort of thinking much more in terms of a meta-analysis of what it is we do, not just for the topic, but for the people who do this. So I'm interested in the types of questions we ask and the ways we go about asking those questions, but also thinking about who's asking those questions, how they're going about answering those questions. And in some cases, clearly there are people who are on very different pages when it comes to African American language. But I think those things are important, and I think they also are things that have to be acknowledged in our research. What matters in this particular thing? Well, Sally talked about, I think his question, or the title of his paper revolved around a choice, evolutionary or historical. And as you can tell, I use the term African American language. And part of that has to do with sort of having come through this process of thinking about this history, in who gets to be the person who says what something is, and also clearly defining what that means. So one of the issues around that that we've seen had to do in 1996 with the Ebonics controversy, and that was probably one of the best gifts that we had as linguists in terms of people, at least lay people, coming to a name for African American language. Even though linguists don't tend to use the term Ebonics, at least it provided some sort of reference point. But what it also revealed to me that was we haven't been very good either in our field or in talking with people about what those distinctions really are. And so there's a lot more discussion now, I think, about what's a language, what's a dialect, do we even have that, does that even make any sense, and sort of how we think about that, but those connections to how we think about it in terms of how we've gotten our names, right? And unfortunately, John Baugh and Geneva Smitherman aren't here because they had these great articles that talked about naming and who gets to do that, and sort of this history of this, in particular with African American language. So we move from something like Negro or non-standard English to Black vernacular, and African American vernacular, and African American language, and even more specifically now with Arthur Spears, who talks about both standard African American English and African American standard English. The reason I use African American language is because, in part, we don't have these well-defined things that we want to talk about. I mean, we refer to things as languages, and we know that there is a political side of that, right, as well as a socio-historical side to that, why some things are called languages, why some things are called dialects, and actually they may be neither or both or something. But for African American language, to me, it was a less problematic way of referring to something that we really don't know. Well, we'll never know everything about it because we can't, it's not like we can go back. We're not Doctor Who. I'm a big Doctor Who fan. So we don't have a TARDIS where we can go back in time and figure, and then talk to people who are actually using this and then sort of thinking about it in this way and then answering all of these questions. But we do the best that we can, and the tools that we have that are used in historical linguistics to get as close as we can to that. So for me, African American language represents sort of this crystallization of thinking about all of these questions that I've had over the course of my career for what it is, what does it look like, well, why do we do this, and who these people actually are who have used this in sort of this makeup. And again, you can see the influence that Sally Coco's had on me. Again, sort of thinking about Sally Coco when there's at one point that he just said he simply defined it as a language spoken by or among African Americans in the same way that we would say for Japanese or linguistic or any other language. And so we get to this, and I think as a lesson that I've learned, I use that term and I define it in that fairly simple way, I suppose, knowing that it's in some respects, it's for convenience, because one of my big areas, actually the area that defines what I do, is along the ideas of identity. And so that I know that not everyone will fit that, but we still have to deal with these questions, and all I do is ask that you be mindful of the terminology that you use and defining the terminology that you use, because everybody isn't doing it for the same reasons or have the same perspective about it. So I don't bash people who use a different term. I just say, please tell me why you're using that term. What does that mean to you? So the panel that we have today gives you a very good representation of that, because they all study these different aspects of African American language. Our first speaker is going to be John Singler, who's going to be talking about the evolution of African American vernacular English evidence from Liberian settler English, which gives you that sort of historical comparative perspective where you can look at people from one particular context and make a comparison from to people who are in a different area but come from similar contexts. And then similarly with Edgar Schneider, African American history from below and its linguistic implications, ecological factors documented in the exclave narratives. Again, we have that comparison, but that particular comparison provides us with this historical perspective from a different time and place to the contribution that we might see now. And then Guy Bailey with the role of demographic change in the evolution of AAVE, who looks at particular across times and periods in the US, and especially that contribution from Texas and the South to how African American language has developed. I think Sally Coco had mentioned earlier that there's a heavy influence, particularly in the Southeast, in terms of the development of African American language. But I love that in following Sally Coco that we get to even see the sort of complexity beyond that. And we'll end with Sally Coco giving discussion remarks and leading the discussion based upon the three presentations that you will have. So while you're here enjoying this session, I'd like for you to sort of think about those particular things and sort of moving from I don't know how you're entering this conversation, whether you're a novice or you're an expert, but wherever you are on that particular spectrum, if you think about those questions and how you come to them in developing more complex questions. And I think just to sort of wrap up, in how I've gotten to those complex questions, I hope you heard this growth happens with not just the more that we read, but integrating ourselves into other areas, into other fields. It's not just the blinders of this is all we do is sociolinguistics. As you can even tell from Sally Coco's career, he's moved through anthropology and Creole studies and syntax and biology and what have you. And I think a lot of us here probably do some similar things, not necessarily those areas, but certainly others that contribute to our questions and our understanding of the very things that we do now. And I think probably one of the biggest things that helps with that is when we go into the classroom and we have to teach students for the first time something that we've done for years and we've grown to love and we're all excited about, and getting them to get from that what, how, why, who in context. So I hope you enjoy our panel, and I think I probably have like 1 minute if there was anything that you want to ask me about before we get started on our 3 minutes, before we get started on our panel. Thank you. I'm a good teacher, so silence doesn't bother me. You and I were like simpatico. Yeah. So you guys are not all novices? I know not this front row, but you're novices. And this is a learning experience for you? Okay. I feel like I should do a Sally Coco thing and say, I know I mentioned Sally a lot because I think Sally's brilliant. And also Sally has like I said, he was there for me early in my career, giving me advice and telling me things to do. But I feel like that for the panel, because I had read that there was something recently in the news about another historical linguistics conference that had some issues around the theme and not sort of having people to better represent the theme. And we have great people representing this, not to say that, but I feel like it's like, what's different about our panel sort of thing. All right? I gave you guys enough time, so if you have no comments or no questions, I will let our first speaker get set up. So our first speaker is John Singler, as I mentioned. He's going to talk to you about the evolution of African American vernacular English, evidence from Liberian settler English. I've known John for quite a long time as well, and this is in his wheelhouse. This is what he's done for most of his career, and one of the things I like about what John has done with Liberian settler English is that it's not just something that he's gone in and done for a year and then moved on to something else. This is something that he's committed his life to, that he works in this area, works with the people, and has developed friendships over the course of his lifetime in doing this. And so he is the best person that we have for this particular job because he knows it well. So thank you, John.
Okay, let me get started here. Okay, thank you, Sandra, for the introduction. I'm going to do something my graduate students taught me to do, but not at this point. When they give a PowerPoint, they always have secret slides. And I'm going to start with some of my secret slides to refer to something that Sally said this morning. And this was about the history of African American English leading up to the 20th century and 21st century. And I know I've still got that on the side. He says that the reason that there was not the development of an African American ethnic, presumably before the Great Migration, is because of all the contact between indentured European servants and enslaved Africans. And he says that, well, in all the tobacco and cotton growing region of the South, which is most of it, the slaves were in the minority and race segregation would only start in the late 19th century. In fact, Galenson reports that by the time of the American Revolution, only Pennsylvania and Chesapeake were still getting indentured servants in large numbers, and they really fell out of the picture by the early 19th century. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't whites around, but they were not indentured servants. That had come to a halt in the U.S. And in terms of African Americans being in minorities and tobacco and cotton plantations, these are the 25 largest slaveholders according to the 1860 census. And you can see 10 of them are from the Sea Islands, the rice-growing area. That's no surprise. And there are 6 from sugar plantations in southeastern Louisiana. And we know that sugar is extremely labor-intensive. I'm assuming that the language spoken would have been French Lexifier. But we have 9 others where it's cotton. 1 in the Alabama Black Belt, and 8 in plantations along the Mississippi River. The Black Belt, so called because of the rich black soil,
was a stretch across mid-Alabama, and in these 8 counties, the population in the 1850 census, I picked that census at random, was 69% enslaved. And then in the cotton growing along the Mississippi River, the population in those 15 counties was 80% enslaved. So, and that's actually quite a large population. In the Sea Islands, water is crucial to the growing of rice. I'm assuming that here the relevance of water is that it made it easier to ship the product. It has nothing to do with growing it. But my point is, there were places in the antebellum South where African Americans were present in large numbers and were clearly the majority. Okay, now let me go back and start from the beginning. Okay, so as you can see, I'm responding to Sally Coco's article in the Oxford Handbook of African American Language, a remarkable book. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And this is really in the abstract. I argue that, in fact, Av and White American Southern English have common origins. They appear to have been one and the same regional variety until Jim Crow was introduced in the late 19th century and triggered the great migration of African Americans out of the South. Av was invented as a separate ethnolect in the North, where most white Americans were then getting their first exposure to American Southern English. And I read that and was puzzled. So black people didn't talk black until some of them went north? I had trouble with that. And I thought it raised 4 intertwined questions. How is it that it suddenly became an ethnolect? What were the innovations that ushered in this change of status? Or was it not innovations, but increasing second-order indexicality? Sally's from Chicago, so Silverstein comes to mind. And if you're saying it was invented, that's agency. Who are the agents? Well, what I realized is that those questions are not addressed in the article. And so I'm going to set them aside too, with one exception, and that has to do with what's an ethnolect? It's never defined in the article. And it may be that it's supposed to be the dialect of an ethnic variety, but Sarah Benor has pointed out real problems with this. First, in terms of intergroup variation, how do you decide who's speaking Av and who isn't, or who's speaking African American English and who isn't? And within the individual, there's a problem. How do you decide when someone is using Av and when they're not? And the list goes on. Her solution is the ethno-linguistic repertoire, which she defines as a fluid set of linguistic resources that members of an ethnic group may use variably as they index their ethnic identities. Now, an issue about this is that a whole subsystem can be part of the speaker's ethno-linguistic repertoire, but so too can individual elements. And that is the use of particular grammatical elements divorced from the system that they're part of. So I want to point that out before we move on. And I hope to be representing Sally Coco's view fairly. He points out that slavery in North America emerged in 2 different places in the 17th century, Virginia and Maryland, the Chesapeake region, and in Charleston later in the century in the Sea Islands. And they had different ecologies and different outcomes. And Virginia is really the place where the American institution of slavery was formed. And that is all the legal trapping, the social aspects. And the model was applied then to tobacco plantations and next to cotton plantations. And it spread across the South in the 18th and then 19th century, whereas the Sea Islands model was largely limited to the Sea Islands. And during this period, this initial period of formation in Virginia, there was extensive ongoing contact between white indentured servants and black slaves, and black indentured servants too, on smaller farms and then on tobacco plantations. The indentured servants were predominant numerically, and the status of the two groups vis-a-vis each other, it wasn't equal at all, but it wasn't so divergent as it became. And with this ecology, slaves had the opportunity to acquire the language of the indentured servants. Now, Sally, I'm going to go through this quickly. He provides a role for substrate languages, but never gets specific. One correction I'd make on his discussion, he points out that at the peak of the slave trade during the 18th century, American planters imported the overwhelming majority of their slaves straight from Africa. But if we're going to use the founder principle, what is shown by both these quotes is that in the 17th century, slaves from the Caribbean were brought in large numbers to Virginia, as well as to the Barbadian colony of Charleston. So this is a situation where part of the founder population would have been from the Caribbean, and it's a way to contribute to the feature pool. Now, I cite Winford at the bottom of this. He pays more attention to the Caribbean contribution to the feature pool for Gullah. But what this really comes down to is how do you explain or allow for the possibility of Caribbean influence on Av, Gullah, and Av without requiring the, sort of, there to be a Creole that came from the Caribbean. And the idea of the feature pool, which is something that Sally developed in the 90s and Jeff Siegel did independently, makes this a possibility. Okay, well, let's go back to the idea of, here I thought, okay, if we're going to talk about ethnolect, then in the 20th century we ought to look at innovations. And I'm using something from that era, though in fact I'll argue it goes back much later, and this is John Myhill's list. Based on the ex-slave recordings and the book done by Bailey, Maynard, and Sucre Avila, of taped interviews with former slaves born in the years from 1844 to 1861. And he looks at 9 features in particular, and the productive, this is a quote from him, the productive use of these features is an entirely new development in Av, which has taken place since the Civil War. Now, 3 of them are the absence of a feature in standard English, omission of verbal S, copula absence especially is deletion, and omission of possessive S. The other 6 are all involve the presence of a non-standard feature. With invariant B, it's the increase in the amount. The others using ain't for didn't, the semi-auxiliary come to express disapproval, the auxiliary steady, the use of be done, and stress been are all proposed as innovations. Now, I want to look at the Liberian evidence, and I'm going to go through the next part fairly quickly. Liberia, as you probably know, was founded by a group whose intention was to create a place in Africa for free people of color. And whatever the reasons for it, Southern slave owners jumped on the idea and were the major financial supporters for it. And in fact, they established the colony of Liberia in 1822. It became an independent nation in 1847. And the settlers, while never more than 3 to 5% of the population, ruled sort of absolutely until the 1980 military coup, a case of the oppressed becoming the oppressor. although the people that I worked with were very poor and had not really benefited in obvious ways. In Liberia, there are 29 Niger-Congo languages, but most of the interaction was in English lexifier varieties, Liberian settler English and Kolokwa, which is the local pidginized variety, and it comes out of, oh, I'm gotten ahead of myself here, but at any rate, comes out of West African Pidgin English, but it has a lot of influence from settler English. Okay, now you can see the settler towns. I'm going to skip through that, except to say that I did my research in Sino, as Greenville, because it was so different. It was part of the reason. First of all, where people came from was different. They came from the lower south, whereas the people who went to the rest of Liberia went to the Middle Atlantic, came from the Middle Atlantic or from free states, New York and Pennsylvania. So there was that big difference. Also, the people who went to Sino, many of them had come from plantations. That wasn't true for the other people. And within, once they got there, they were basically abandoned by everybody. And so they had no external support. They had no missionaries. They didn't get along with their neighbors. They went to war with their neighbors. And they were incredibly isolated, and they still are. Actually, this picture with the mud is when the road was at least operating. When I was there last year, the bridge was out, so you couldn't get there. And I did research first in 3 different places, and then much more with Jose Ellis, a community member, in Greenville, but also the upriver settlements, Lexington, Louisiana, and Blunsville. And again, I'm going to go through this quickly. First of all, I make the point that, yes, I was working in Sino, but everything I found there in terms of existence of features was true throughout the settler communities. The difference is quantitative. Okay, with these 3, the ones that are absent, they're there in big numbers, but Sally Coco has pointed out that the first 2 are present among white speakers in the South, and Jack Chambers lists them among what he calls vernacular universals. For the ones that are present, they're all found, but Bin is not just wildly frequent, so there's that difference. Also, be done does not have this second meaning, the conditional resultative meaning that it has developed in African American English, and likewise stressed bin, while it has it is used in the usual way, there are what's going on here? Yes, I'm going in the wrong direction. There we go. Okay, now let's start over. Okay, but there are uses of bin in modern African American English that are ungrammatical for settlers. Okay, so we see that all the features are there, except maybe the expansion of B, and some of them are early on, but they're there. And so the settlers brought them with, there's just been minimal contact since then of a way. So if they're in Liberia, the settlers have them, that's because they brought them with them, probably prior to 1854. Now, where did the early settlers come from? The original settlers over the first 25 years, 70% came from Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, with Virginia the big state. Virginia also dominated politics. Where were they from in Virginia? 2 non-rural areas, Norfolk, Portsmouth, and Richmond, Petersburg, and the third was a chain of counties that were fringe agriculture. These are not people coming from the plantation. In other words, it represents a continuation of the early pattern described by Sally of extensive contact between whites and blacks. And Frederick Cassidy says in Virginia and Maryland, slaves were never as separate from work and general life of their owners as in the South. Plantations or households were much smaller, and the numerical proportion of blacks to whites was never as high. So we've got these two things. We've got African Americans living in close contact with whites in 17th century vernacular. They had access to the local white vernacular and obviously had the ability to acquire it. And yet immigrants to Liberia from Virginia and elsewhere displayed distinctively Av features. And by distinctively, I also mean uniquely. I'm not aware that any of these features, the presence ones, not the absence, show up in white Southern varieties. Now, are these two statements at odds? Well, Solly distinguishes between origins and evolution, but I don't see how that helps, because if it happened during evolution, not during origins, how do we prove that or disprove it, and what does that achieve? Later in the article, he says, well, maybe the peculiarities, his word, were already part of tobacco and cotton plantation English before Jim Crow, and either white Southerners lost them or African Americans amplified them. He doesn't mention the third possibility, namely that white Southerners never had them, and the African Americans created them on their own. If we go back to the 17th century, whites in 1607, blacks in 1619, but already in 1640 there's a trial of 3 runaways. The 2 whites are given extended periods to their indenture. The black is said, well, you're a slave for life. And in general, punishment of runaways was much more severe for whites than blacks, because what are you going to do with blacks? They're already slaves for life. And in that period, from 1640 to 1660, there was a major deterioration of relations, more recognition of slavery, more racial feeling is a nice way of saying racism. Now, it's possible that, yes, everybody was there, and yes, the opportunity was there, but maybe it was a matter of agency and identity. And if we're going to say that Av was invented, why not invent it in the 17th century when people were being discriminated against because of their membership in a group? In other words, maybe this is when the ethno-linguistic repertoire started. And you could say that, well, this is sort of a facile solution because it can include, well, it can include whole subsystems, but also individual lexical items. But it's been pointed out that those individual lexical items are often very important for identity. And if we're concerned about Av in terms of identity, then maybe that's where it comes from. I'm very tentative about throwing out the ethno-linguistic repertoire and sort of tentative in all of this, but I do want to make the point that the people who showed the Av features in Liberia were coming from this context of high mixture of white and black in daily interaction. For the final 20 seconds, I want to point out that there's a whole question of the relationship of Gullah and Av, and Sutcliffe presents several. Solly acknowledges them, says, well, maybe there was the same kind of ecology elsewhere that happened with Gullah, and that's how it happened. Gullah has such, as he's shown, has such a distinctive ecology that seems quite surprising. The other possibility, he said, well, yeah, some Gullah people immigrated there, and some of those who originated in coastal South Carolina may have kept some Gullah-like features and perhaps transmitted them to some of their offspring. It's sort of like, well, instead of Grandma giving me the family Bible, she gave me the aspect markers. It doesn't happen like that. I don't think this is the answer. Winford, 2017, builds on my work and goes much further in arguing for the presence of Gullah features in Av throughout the South. And with that promissory note from somebody else, I'll stop.
Thank you, John. That was great. That is a debate I've had with Sally for about 20 years about the issue. Did I leave my book up there by chance, too?
Yes, you did.
The issue of the role of identity, and that's what we're talking about in terms of the sociocultural and historical context, but this role of identity, that there is agency, right, that we do make decisions, there is agency that we do make decisions based upon these interactions, this development of our sense of self within just individually as well as communally, and what that means in terms of power, et cetera. So great, great paper, thank you. So questions? You can go from here in directing them. I think we have, I lost my program, so that's why I had to get it back. We haven't, oh yeah, that's right, I guess I did keep you on time. You have 5 minutes for your questions.
Yes?
Thank you. Just a general question, just to go back to the paper that Sally was presenting. What do you think are the ecological factors that the Creoles that developed on the African side of the Atlantic and the American side of the Atlantic have in common? And what can we somehow find factors that these language varieties have in common and factors that they don't? What do they share?
Yeah, we can. And I first of all, settler English is not a Creole. Colloquial is pidginized, but in a continuum model. But one of the issues for the varieties in West Africa, like Sierra Leone Creole, but also Niger and Nigeria, Ghanaian Pidgin English, and Caribbean Creoles, and, for example, Gullah, is if you're starting out with the same set of L1s, how do you know the interaction? For example, if Gullah shows something, how do you know if it came from the Caribbean or from Africa? And there are certainly strong phonological similarities. And frankly, I was reminded of them. I had to think every time I said ethnolect, because I've spent enough time in Liberia that I don't do consonant clusters very well. So there's the phonology that actually then has morphological consequences for English. There are certain things, for example, plural number marking. Many West African languages do not mark a head noun if there's a numeral in the NP, and that shows up in various ways. And so there are some grammatical things like that. To me, it's the phonology that's more apparent.
I was thinking about like social factors that these communities may have in common, which would lead to the formation of a Creole or just, let's say, an English dialect. Can we think about things that certain societies had in common on both sides of the ocean that led to the formation of Creoles, and factors that they didn't have in common? And for this reason, we can understand why in a certain region we got a Creole and in another region we just got an English dialect, for example.
That's, I'd really have to think about that. I don't think of anything, and part of it, well, one generalization from West Africa is the extent of multilingualism, even in early or pre-colonial times. So there's a pattern of multilingualism and expecting that. I'm not sure how that ties in. But in a lot of other ways, there are so many different societies in Africa and so many different approaches to social interaction that it'd be hard for me to think of something that would apply more generally.
Thank you.
I was recently reading the book Nassau Plantation by James Kearney. Yes, I was recently reading a book by James Kearney, who's a distinguished local historian here of the Texas Germans. And he mentioned, something to my surprise, that this plantation in Fayette County had bought 9 slaves, and that slavery was quite common among Germans in the eastern part of the Texas German area. And firstly, I'm wondering what language they used on these plantations, the Germans with their slaves. And secondly, I think probably some of the slaves learned German, which would have relieved the pressure of English on whatever English they brought with them from the East. And I would recommend that intensive studies of black speech in the eastern Texas German area might show Gullah-like features that were brought from the East.
Thank you. Well, this is Winford's point, Winford 2017. He's done a lot of research on demographics and the extent to which there was this massive movement from what he calls the seaboard states to the cotton states and then to Texas. So much so that, for example, the enslaved population in South Carolina in 1860 was less than it was in 1830. So that would introduce a Gullah presence into feature pools, as at the same time you had new people coming.
Thank you very much, John. I know I will have my time at the end of the session, but I want to clarify something about invention. What I think I said is that African American English as an ethnoleg was invented by Northerners that didn't know it. It's something that I also said earlier this morning, that it was invented by Northerners, and since then we have characterized something that was fundamentally a Southern variety as an African American variety.
Thank you. If I can answer that quickly, you said it very indirectly, and I responded to it indirectly, and that is my comment that African American Vernacular English was a second order indexical item, was taking your statement that Southern English would have been first order and African American English second order. You didn't come out and say who invented it, but yes, that was implied. So that then gets into this question of agency. And you and I have disagreed about agency for years and years. So.
All right, so you're not the only one who's had this long-standing thing going on. Our time has come to an end. It's time for your break. Thank you so much for joining us for the first part of the session, but be sure to come back for the second part of the session.
Doch, ich komme nach. Ja, ja. Ich schaue dann schon raus.
I didn't realize that you guys hadn't been briefed about this. Okay, so it's just because we're streaming. So in order to get the slideshow, we didn't want to like record these because it would be bad quality. So we're getting it directly from your computer. Yeah, so we just have to hook them up. Okay, I'm going to.
Oops. I guess it's working. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so thank you for coming back in for the second half of the African American language panel. I hope those people outside can hear who are getting their coffee so they can stroll back in. For the second half, we're going to start with Edgar Schneider, who's talking about African American history from below and its linguistic implications. I've known Edgar for a long time. I'm so glad that he was able to come here. He published my first book with John Benjamins, and I've admired his work, of course, as well. I love the fact that he works on this historical part of looking at language and African American language in particular, and that he's been an editor of our book series that I think has been very popular and done John Benjamins very well. And so I'm glad he was able to join us because I haven't had the chance to see him for a long time. So please join me in welcoming Edgar Schneider.
Thank you very much, Sonja, for the kind introduction. It's a very great thing for me to be here. I'm honored being non-African American, not even an American, to be allowed to speak at this panel. As you all know, there's been a long-standing debate about the origins of African American English, some 50 years or so. The question's been to what extent the dialect is African in character or British dialectal in terms of its linguistic input. Basically still unresolved, although if I see that correctly by today, there is a strong tendency to accept compromise positions as valid, to see that there's been significant input from both sides. African American English essentially is a contact-induced variety, and the relative strength of either component depends on differences as to region, context, style, and things like that. If you look into the papers by Gerard von Herke, John Rickford, or Sally Mufwene, Winford, Wolfram, and Kuhn, in Sonja's monumental handbook of African American language, I guess that's ultimately how you can summarize those positions. In order to resolve the issue, there are two ways of asking relevant questions. One would be intralinguistically, structurally, what kinds of linguistic phenomena do we have? Can we look at textual evidence that shows us whether there are Creole African versus British English components? And secondly, the extralinguistic, or in terms of this workshop, ecological perspective, look at social conditions, sociolinguistic frameworks in order to assess to what extent language contact of whatever kind is likely. I'll be focusing on the second of these perspectives today, that is operating largely on a not really specifically linguistic frame, in line with the topic of the workshop. After a very brief look at the first one, structural documentation, looking into what kinds of linguistic phenomena we have, is faced with what Bill Labov long time ago called the bad data problem. We just don't get the kind of evidence that would resolve these issues because we don't have historical non-standard texts, let alone recordings. My own modest contribution was analyzing the ex-slave narratives that I'll be introducing in a moment, that was published a couple of decades ago in Alabama. Originally it was my dissertation, and in its time I think it was fairly influential, well received. Shana Poplack, Sally Tagliamonte credited with being influential. Wolfram had a long review article in Language in 1990 and so on. I was lucky to have been invited to contribute to that handbook as well, and I surveyed the kind of evidence that we have, the sources including literary attestations, these ex-slave narratives, but also the Congress recordings that were mentioned earlier, Hyatt's Hoodoo recordings, diaspora speech island evidence, semi-literate writings, and so on. Today I want to focus on this ecological perspective, the life conditions of African Americans in the antebellum South, that is communicative settings, and possibly likely consequences for language evolution. We do have writings by historians from various perspectives, of course, but I want to give a voice to the speakers themselves, hear authentically first-hand evidence, life memories and stories of antebellum life as told by the ex-slave narratives themselves, going back to this WPA ex-slave narrative collection, whose subtitle significantly is A Composite Autobiography. In other words, I'm trying to do something like history from below, reject an exclusively or at least predominantly white perspective that's been dominating historiography, and give the victims of slavery a voice themselves. The sources that I'm looking at, the WPA ex-slave narratives, go back to one of Roosevelt's New Deal post-Depression projects that haven't produced only the San Antonio Canal, the River Walk, as I learned yesterday, but also the Federal Writers Project, giving employment to very broadly people to be categorized as writers. And as one of their many activities, they collected several thousand systematically employed recordings with former slaves, which were conducted throughout the United States. They had a list of questions to be asked, including the whole sphere of ex-slave lives, family, housing, labor, clothing, food, relationships to whites, punishments, customs, superstitions, religion, festivities, experiences in the Civil War, emancipation, and also in the post-war period. They were typed, and the typescripts have been collected, tended to be left and housed in various state archives. Some were submitted to the headquarters in Washington, D.C., and left at the Library of Congress until in the 1970s, a historian called Raywick published them in very many volumes, 19 originally, and there are a couple of later supplement volumes looking mainly into state archive materials. The linguistic reliability of these ex-slave narratives has been an issue of debate. The interviewers were instructed to record their speech as nearly word for word as is possible, but quite clearly there is a filter in between. They probably took notes and then ultimately spelled those out from memory and notes. In my contribution to the Handbook of Language Variation and Change, I called this a text type recalled. And there's some evidence that editing also was carried out before submitting the typescripts to the headquarters for whatever reason. Natalie Maynard did that. It's supposed that the later supplement series, which don't come from Washington but from original regional texts, have less editing. But overall, clearly it's not verbatim records of speech, but on the other hand, especially given the breadth and systematicity of the coverage of the material, it's hugely interesting and largely reliable stuff. Socio-historically, probably even more problematic, clearly very difficult to assess. There is reason for some skepticism as to not to take what's been predicted at face value. Given the interview situation, those were white interviewers who went to talk to elderly African Americans who probably might have been afraid of losing the little support money that they got. It's quite clear that a lot of sugarcoating has to be expected, and what we get in very many ways is a representation of what's been called the paternalistic view of antebellum race relationships, saying, well, actually it wasn't that bad and we were treated quite nicely, downplaying the harsh reality for various reasons. So we have to accept whatever's coming up now, reluctantly take it with a grain of salt, but nevertheless, I think it's a uniquely broad, comprehensive, authentic type of data source. I'm looking at the very same set of text interviews that I used for my dissertation very many decades ago. Then they were selected on the basis of a pre-test for linguistic reliability, which isn't relevant here. It's not a random sample, quite clearly, but on the other hand, there's also no reason to believe that it would be distorted, skewed on account of the type of stuff that I'm looking at in any way. The sample consists of 104 interviews from 9 states, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Missouri, Texas, and Arkansas. It's roughly gender balanced. The average age of the speakers or interviewees was 85 years. There are a couple of them beyond 100 years of age. We don't really get too much information about occupation, but clearly the majority were field hands. In 20 cases, they're explicitly house servants who had more exposure to white speech, obviously. About half of them not quite explicitly state they lived in the slave quarters, 11 on the other hand in the big house, and for the others we don't get that information. In terms of education, a little more than a quarter explicitly say they can't read and write at all, they've never had any schooling. About 10% say they have at least limited reading and writing skills, and roughly the same say they had good schooling. That means in this context, basically they're able to read and write. About the others, we don't get information. So what I'm trying to do now is just give you a couple of samples. In a few cases, I'll try to quantify and categorize the responses as far as reasonably possible. In the other cases, I've just selected a few pieces of qualitative documentation from these interviews, reproducing interview excerpts, and I hope you can read them on the slides up here. And I'm covering the topics that the slaves were asked for: plantation sizes, attitudes towards whites, reports of cruelties, punishments, running away, resistance, statements on being owned and slave sales, but also festivities, celebrations, work conditions, food and clothes, religion. A very important point, interaction between black and white children from a linguistic perspective, and also post-war and emancipation memories and experiences. Plantation sizes, the larger the background, very obviously, the less likely is interracial black-white communication, accommodation, chances for talking across racial boundaries. In small plantations, that very obviously is unavoidable. So in large plantations, contact effects, creolization are more likely to occur. We have a fairly small number of really small plantations, less than 10 slaves, as in the first quotation. Mr. Clemens owned less than a dozen slaves. Also a reasonably small number of mid-sized, roughly 10 to 50, and 31 of the about 100 plus explicitly state that was a large plantation with more than 50 slaves, as in the second example, a big plantation and a heap of slaves. He had so many he couldn't keep our faces in his mind. Attitude to the white masters and misses, that is the most problematic and controversial of all points. A huge number, 2/3, say it was basically positive, but I don't think that's believable at all. If you look into the very next slides, that's really highly questionable. That represents this paternalistic type of view. A few say it's explicitly negative and neutral. Some say it's explicitly negative, and a few say it's split, so that one of them, usually the missus, dealt nicely with the slaves, was friendly, and the master was cruel. So, for instance, the first quotation, Emily Green, our master and Miss Patsy were mighty good to us. On the other hand, the second one, Master Jordan, was very hard on his niggers. He worked them overtime and didn't give them enough to eat. They didn't have no clothes. They only had shoes made out of wood. The third one then is this split representation. To be honest, the slave says the master wasn't good. Truth is delight, and he was one mean white man, but the mistress was heaps better than that, whatever that might have meant in this context. Quite clearly, cruelties, punishment were pieces of everyday reality. Everybody knew about that. 19 of these interviews explicitly state it hasn't happened at our place, as the first one, for instance, our master was a good man, nobody was ever whipped, we didn't have any overseers. But in the vast majority of instances, we have extremely cruel reports and cases of whippings by masters and mostly really overseers, as in the second case, the big white man called Duncan. He had to see that the slaves behaved right. They called him the boss man. He always carried a big whip, and when the Negroes got sassy, they got them whipped across their hides, and so on. For the next two ones, they would beat them till they were bloody. They give them some 300, 400 licks. And also the last one, the overseer was the meanest man ever put life in. He didn't let us have no fire, no matter how cold it was. And then the nigger hounds would look for you if you went around or ran away. And they would beat you nearly to death. This is a lengthy story of an extremely cruel event where one African American, the big Leonard, who wasn't scared, resisted and said, look at those soldiers, they want to avoid us from being free, and the master gets angry, and his wife wants to detain him from acting violently, but he wants his gun to be brought and gets it and pushes everybody else aside and ultimately shoots a hole in Leonard's chest big as your fist, and so on. I don't want to read it out altogether. If you're interested, you have the names, and the collection is publicly available. I guess most academic libraries would have it. The main way of resisting or acting against the cruelties of the system was simply running away, and that apparently was common practice all across the South. In about a quarter of all interviews, we get explicit mentionings of having run away. Only twice we explicitly get the statement, nobody did that. But here in the first sample, for instance, there's a narrative about a slave, a child in slavery days, whose father had been able to save a little money for side jobs and then was informed that he was on the point of being sold. So that night the father ran away, and the slave says, the young man says, I ain't never seen my papi since last I heard of him, he was in quote unquote Indiana. And then the second one is a rather typical account of tracing, chasing runaway slaves, niggers that ran away, were traced by the hounds on the track of the overseer, and in this case they ran him up a tree, the overseer fetched him back next morning, tucked them in, and so on, and so on. Constant practice, very obviously, also was the danger of being sold, and we get quite a number, more than half of all, about half of all interviews explicitly mentioning the practice of being sold, details about slave auctions, things like that. As in the first one, for instance, my first missus sold me because I was stubborn. She sent me to a slave yard at Nashville that was full of slaves. I stayed there for 2 weeks before Master Simpson bought me. I was sold away from my husband, and I never seen him again. I had one child, which I took with me. But even that wasn't guaranteed. Nigger buyers came around our place. That's the second one. It was a sight to see. There would be some 5 or 6 men riding horses and driving a flock of slaves along the road, stocked, chained, all together. And the last one, also one of those extremely cruel stories. My mother was sold from me when I was 6 weeks old, and my missus raised me. Work, the customary conditions was, as is quoted in the first case, from sunup to sundown, that is all day during light work conditions, were extremely hard in the fields, mostly cotton fields. Small children were expected, whenever they were able, old enough to do that, to, for instance, as in the second case, bring water, fetch wood into the kitchen, and do things like that. And apart from that, there were all kinds of other jobs, like in the third quotation, making clothes for the entire plantation, weaving, spinning, knitting, and so on. There were a couple of other jobs as well around the big house. Food and clothes, usually the reports state that the slaves got enough, although of mean quality. Meat, for instance, was apparently a decisive factor. If you got any, then that was a sign of reasonably good treatment. First sample, for instance, the master was a poor man, but he fed us all as good as he could with local products, turnips, cabbage, collards, green corn, and so on. Chicken dinners was sort of special. Second one, he gave us plenty to eat. It was nothing fine, but it was good, plain eating. What filled you up kept you well. Obviously, the whites had an interest in preserving the strength and the health of their slave population. Religion, superstition were interesting topics. Christian religion was spread widely. In the majority of instances, slaves were allowed to sit in the back rows of whatever churches there were. In a couple of cases, they just went out into the bush, what was called a brush arbor, and very often we get samples of what I might call functional preaching. In other words, the preacher talked to the slaves exclusively and told them to behave, whereas in the first example, the preacher man would get up there and tell us, now you mind your old master and missus and don't steal from them, and so on. And then various kinds of treatments. The local practice of getting married, familiar throughout the historical South, was jumping the broom. A very simple type of ceremony described in the third of these samples. When my grandma got married, they just jumped the broomstick and they were considered man and wife. That was the custom. Then the master would hold the broomstick and so on. We also have hoodoo practices. Here's kind of a lengthy report on applications of witchcraft and herbs practiced in this case by the speaker's grandmother, and a few more words on explicit hoodoo activities like pains in the legs being treated by herbs and preventing slaves and stuff like that. Festivities and celebrations, yes, in some cases there were times for that, mostly in context with work conditions. Barn dances, corn shuckings were apparently occasions for major drinking and festivities. Some large plantations had fiddlers, and sometimes we have reports that Saturday nights until Sunday morning there were conditions for dancing. To alleviate the harsh conditions of life, not everywhere, but at least 39 times out of about 100 plus, we get reports of that. Linguistically important is the fact that children up to a small but still certain age played together across racial boundaries, and that very obviously has its effects linguistically. About a quarter of all narratives report that, for instance, in the first case, we played marbles, riding the stick horse, etc., etc. White children that lived around were with them. In the second case, one of the slave children is about to be sold, but then somebody was going to buy me, but the young folks begged master not to sell me because we'd all played together. Apparently there was some emotional attachment across ethnic boundaries, at least amongst the children of that age. And in the last one it also says white and nigger children all played together. Civil War memories, typically explicitly mentioned 75 times. Typically these are reports of Yankee soldiers coming along and stealing food, and they are perceived as the others quite clearly, the cruel ones. There are a couple of reports also when family members fought for the Confederacy and went to war. Also African Americans, if I see that correctly, predominantly they also fought for the South together with their masters without explicitly being told if that did so voluntarily. Emancipation is an interesting point. We have a couple of cases, 8 out of the 100+ narratives, when we're explicitly told that the slaves just simply weren't told that the Civil War is over and that they now were free. In the majority of cases, 33 times, they were explicitly told. So, for instance, the master had the overseer blow the horn about 10 o'clock and told them all they was free. He said he'd work them for wages, and most of them actually stayed. But in the second case, for instance, they want to keep us as long as they could, so we didn't even know about the end of the Civil War and about freedom having been obtained. Yeah, I'm afraid something's wrong here. I don't know. But my time's up anyhow. So what does all of this mean? Linguistically speaking, we have evidence for a very mixed kind of social system, I think, where you cannot deduce the simple conclusions. It's basically very clearly an absolutely inhumane system. We have labels such as the peculiar institution, which barely mask the cruelty that is involved in all of this. So there's a lot of tendency to camouflage the realities of antebellum life in historiography. Linguistically, probably we had variable conditions, some contexts which allowed for cross-ethnic communication, even accommodation, but in the majority of instances, quite clearly, we have a huge distance between the races and not really a context which would foster linguistic accommodation processes. In the long run, I guess the evidence of the ex-slave narratives comes from a period which is too insignificantly late anyhow. We see, if at all, the 1860s represented here, and the formative period, given the founder principle that Sully set up, clearly must have been much earlier. So to what extent we get evidence on the formation of the dialect is also questionable. What remains is these are deeply moving stories and life memories, clearly worth reading, remembering, narratives of suffering and persistence, which I'd recommend to have a look into for that very reason. Thank you for your attention.
We have just over 3 minutes for questions.
Representing, was there any attempt at representing the language itself? Like, did you find features that you say, well, these are AVP features?
I haven't come across any meta discourse, if that's what you mean.
Well, partly that, yes.
Yeah. I mean, the language is represented. You see it in all these samples. That's actually quite nice dialect in very many ways. But I don't remember having come across any remarks on forms of communication in the plantation or across ethnic boundaries. That, I guess, was simply not a topic of interest to the average
Is there any reference
person.
to languages other than English, or Nothing. Or words that were used that were not.
There are occasional references to Native American languages and to Native American ancestry or family members that were involved, but very marginally. I don't quite remember the Louisiana records. I guess there is some mention of French there, obviously for regional reasons, but apart from that, no.
When you were speaking about the relationships between black and white children, I was thinking of this entire genre of American children's literature, which I'm not sure exists outside the US, where there's a fairy or maybe an elf, very small creature who befriends a child and is then in a position of total dependence on that child because it has to be kept secret. The adults can't know about the existence of fairies or others. And now this suggests to me that this is some kind of folk memory or nostalgia for these kinds of relationships where there would be a young child slave given to a white child as a companion and playmate / servant. There's some sort of folk memory of that. The relationship is so similar in this dependence. There's the infamous book, The Indian in the Cupboard, where it's a toy that comes to life and is actually kept in a box, like a dark box, as a prison, and so it's both shrunk and secret and ethnically otherized, all of those, and the only exception I can think of is a British one by Noel Streatfeild, well-known children's author, but she moved to South Africa as a teenager, where she might have seen similar dynamics. So I think we can see these as a persistence, or at least a memory of these relationships, social relationships, which may not exist in reality, but are part of the cultural context for American children still.
I think these might be camouflaged references to that kind of situation.
I would say unconscious, but certainly, yes, part of the cultural context that's persisting.
It's something I'm not familiar with at all, but if you could give me references or guidance, I'd appreciate
Sure,
that.
I'll make a list.
Thank you. There's one question up here.
Thank you. When you talked about marriages, you mentioned this idiomatic expression, jumping the broom. I was wondering if marriage was legally valid or if it was just a sort of custom that they had, but from a legal point of view, it was not valid. So I'm not sure about it.
I don't think it would have been legally respected in any way. I mean, as you saw earlier on, couples were separated just simply by one of the partners being sold away.
Right,
and
so
it was
this was not
customary practice to give some sort of external form, as I see it.
So
it varied as well, I guess, in those plantations where treatment wasn't that harsh, and relationships between male and females who considered themselves married were respected, and they had children together and all that. But fundamentally, I don't think that had any legal status.
Right, because when you mentioned that, I was just wondering that, because it actually, to go back to what I was saying yesterday.
It's basically what was called cattle slavery, so legally these people just were goods things.
They didn't have a legal personality, I think they couldn't legally be married. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Join me in thanking Ed for here.
Thank you.
All right, so as we transition, we have our next speaker, last paper presentation, Guy Bailey, on the role of demographic change in the evolution of AAVE. I've known Guy for a long time as well. I've known him since I was at least a graduate student, and he was a dean where the New Ways of Analyzing Variation was held at the University of Las Vegas. And he and his wife were very kind to me and had been kind to me ever since. He's part of the reason why I'm even here at the University of Texas, San Antonio, where he was formerly provost and is now president of the UT Rio Grande Valley system. He's also one of the sponsors for the event. So join me in welcoming Dr. Guy Bailey.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's a distinguished group of people, and as Sanja said, we've known each other a long time, have a great deal of respect for all of them. Edgar and I were talking. We met 35 years ago, and Sally, same thing. It's just been so it's been nice reuniting with everybody. My argument today is really pretty simple, and it's that African Americans have the most complex demographic history of any population group in the United States. Uh-oh, I did something. There we go. They have the most complex demographic history profile of any group in the United States, and that if you don't take the entire demographic sweep into account, you can't explain African American vernacular. And many of the anomalies fall into place if you take into account the entire demographic sweep. The whole approach of the ecology of language is particularly fruitful for looking at African American vernacular. And again, it's focused on things like migration, marginalization, interaction among languages is very important there. If you look at the socio-demographic context in which AAVE developed, as I said, they're the most complex in the history of the United States, and there are really four broad socio-demographic environments you have to take into account. There's a whole period of slavery, and I want to talk about each of these in a little bit of detail later, from 1619 to the end of the Civil War, a period of farm tenancy from 1870 to 1940, which is very important, the period of the Great Migration, which has been referred to earlier, especially between 1940 and 1970, and then since 1980, the Great Reversal has been undergoing a Great Migration has been undergoing a reversal, and that's important as well. So a little bit about each of these contexts. Some caveats, so remember that not every African American was part of all these contexts. If you take slavery, the vast majority of the population were slaves, but in the Upper South, for example, 10% were not. The temporal boundaries between these periods are fluid and overlap, and the contexts each have internal complications. But the important point is this: the vast majority of the population fits into these contexts. A key thing, migration and population shifts are at the center of three of the four contexts. Now, farm tenancy being the exception, that restricted migration to some extent. So migration, population shifts are key. If you think about slavery, slavery existed in the United States for 2 centuries, but large-scale slavery in the United States was really a very late development. In 1700, only about 20,000 slaves had been imported. And the expansion of the slave trade coincided with the expansions of cotton production in South Carolina, the Georgia Low Country after 1730, and in the interior South after 1793. The most active decades in the slave trade after 1790. Think about how late that was. 1790 to 1810, more than half of the slaves imported to the United States came after 1793. Think about that. It's very late development. Another way of looking at it, more slaves were imported during the 50 years after 1810. Slavery is illegal at this time. It's illegal. More slaves were imported after slavery was made illegal than in the 110 years before 1930. So when you think about that, you have to think about a very late and short period of time. And Figure 1 provides estimated annual importations of slaves, and you can see after 1790 the huge jump in slavery there. 1793, of course, is the invention of the cotton gin, and that permits the expansion of cotton into the interior South. Now, the slave trade also involves significant internal migration, and as I mentioned, the invention of the cotton gin was the important thing there. And this shift there's a shift southward and westward of slavery. And this shift involves both foreign and domestic slave trade. And the domestic slave trade quickly becomes larger than the foreign slave trade. So if you think about people making money in Virginia in 1840, it's more through the sale of slaves than through the sale of tobacco. It's a sad part of history of our country, but it's a fact. 1 million slaves were moved from the East Coast to the interior South, but at the same time that that's happening, remember, slaves are still being imported directly from Africa into the interior South. So the interior South includes a real mix of recent imports from Africa, slaves from the East Coast. And so by the middle of the 19th century, the majority of slaves live in the interior South. Now, the Civil War ended slavery but left an economic void, and farm tenancy emerged to fill that void. And some things about it: it preserved the system of plantation agriculture. It created a kind of debt peonage through a crop lien system where if you were a farmer, you were tied to the land you cultivated, usually 40, 50 acres, something like that, through debt, through crop liens. And it restricted migration, but it did create stable communities. Now, the thing about the farm tenancy system, over time, whites were drawn into this as well. Because remember, there's no capital in the South after the Civil War. You're dependent on Northern capital coming in and financing this. Everybody goes in. So you have debt peonage in the South. And so my family's a great example. Both grandfathers were tenant farmers. And over a period of time, more and more whites were. And so you had a system where blacks and whites were both tenant farmers, sometimes on the same, tenants on the same large land holdings there. And the percentage of tenant farmers increases fairly dramatically between 1870 and 1930. One other thing, this system of tenancy eventually leads to the emergence of villages in the South, and more about that in just a minute. The figure 2 provides data on the expansion of the farm tenant system. So you can see in 1930, and the standard book on this is Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, the James Agee book, which some of you probably know. More on farm tenancy, the growth of villages and towns in the South after 1880 is largely a development of the emergence of country stores. And these stores emerged as middlemen to dispense credit from northern banks. And the stores were usually owned by the person who owned all the land. And then settlements grew up around the stores, and these stores became centers of rural life where people could interact. They were the primary places of interaction in the American South. And remember, the majority of the population until 1950 in the South lived in communities of less than 2,500, in communities like this. And figure 3 documents the emergence of these country stores, and you can see how extensively they develop in the period between 1870 and 1885 there. Anyway, the confluence of two forces ended tenancy. The 2 world wars and later the baby boom created significant job opportunities in the South. So you have a massive migration of African Americans, also white Southerners too, outside, leaving the South. And then the mechanization of farming, especially after World War II, eliminated the need for tenant farmers. A fact here, in 1900, 90% of African Americans lived in the South, 75% in rural areas, but that changes dramatically after World War II. And farm tenancy created opportunities for African Americans and whites to live in close proximity and to interact, though not as social equals, certainly, but economic equals sometimes. The Great Migration, on the other hand, provides the impetus for distinct communities and distinct cultural identities. And the Great Migration is a movement from the rural South to the urban North, driven by job opportunities in the North, involves 6 million African Americans, I think actually 9 million whites, but a smaller percentage of the white population. And figure 4 shows the extent of the Great Migration. You can see, especially after 1940, massive migration outside the South. Some of the consequences of that, remember in 1890, 90% of African Americans in the South. By 1970, 47% live outside the South. In 1970, 34% of the African American population lives in 7 cities outside the South, and it's primarily a migration to inner cities. By the 1970s, 60% of African Americans live in inner cities, and the movement to the inner city coincides with a movement of whites away from that. You've got sort of opposing demographic movements at the same time. So in the urban north, to quote Tolnay, residential segregation replaced the southern plantation economy as the most powerful force shaping the lives of African Americans. And again, Figure 5 shows this change. And the reversal of the Great Migration has been, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it's primarily a movement from the urban north to the urban south, cities like Atlanta and Chicago and Charlotte. And this is primarily a movement of fairly well-educated African Americans and well-educated. Think about this: uneducated African Americans moving north, educated ones moving back. But this is complicated by the growth of other populations like Latinos in the South too. And again, this figure shows you the reversal of the Great Migration, especially from the Northeast. Linguistic consequences of this. I'm going to quickly go through 6 features. Actually, I'll have a 7th bonus one here, and talk about how you have to have all of these things, each of these demographic movements, to understand what's happened to African American vernacular. And neither the Creole nor the Anglicist hypothesis can do this. They're kind of linear developments that don't take into account the full complexity, demographic complexity affecting African Americans. And I'm going to skip the stuff about the Springville Project. It's very interesting. My co-conspirator is here, and so she can, well, we only have 10 minutes left here. We got to get to the features. So, but Springville, Texas, was a small relic of the tenant farming. Essentially, it was. We were able to find a sample tenant farming village still in operation in the 1980s, and we're able to do significant research there. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes from Springville, and you can read about that, and we can talk about that more in detail. But the 6 features I want to talk about, there's certain features that apparently date back to the beginnings of AAVE, and they can't really be explained through contact from English. They either come from source languages or from language contact. And there are things like monophthongal A and O. People mention the slave recordings. If you listen to the slave recordings, the thing that struck me the first time I heard them were monophthongal A and O. We don't have monophthongal A and O in most varieties of English, but you do in the slave recordings. And zero copula can't really be explained any other way. 2 things that don't appear until the last part of the 19th century, things like the pen-pen merger and fixin' to fitna, you see emerging in the last half of the 19th century. And then 2 features that don't appear to the 20th century, and especially after World War II, habitual, be plus ing, and had plus past, and then our bonus feature later on. But if you look at Figure 7, this is the vowel system of an African-American female former slave from Hempstead, Texas, one of the slave recordings. And if you look at A and O, you can see virtually no off-glide there. They're monophthongs. Most of the people recorded in the former slaves recording, most of the African-Americans have monophthongal A or O, very short off-glides, very different from what you have in any variety of white English. If you compare this with a white male born in 1947 I think he was born in Arkansas but grew up in Dallas, you can see that both A and O are diphthongal there and different. If you look at an African American born in 1912, you can see the beginnings of diphthongization with A and O in both cases. And then if you go on to 1961, you can see fully diphthongal A and O. So something a feature that's very distinct in early African American English and over time becomes more and more like what you see in white speech. Zero copula is complex as well. I'm going to skip that one. I'll come back to that later on. But again, a feature that can't be explained by contact with English and must have come from a source language or from the language contact situation. The Penn-Penn merger is something that actually developed fairly late in both black and white English. Many of the things that are characteristic of African American English, like the Penn-Penn merger, and that also appear in Southern white English, are developments in the last half of the 19th century during the period of tenant farming when you had two populations working closely together. I like to think of Southern American English as actually a joint creation of blacks and whites that probably developed during this period. But again, this takes LAGS data, LAMSAS data, Linguistic Atlas data, and some written data, and you can see the late emergence of that. Fixin' to is also a very late emerging thing, and again, very common and commonly associated with both black and white English, but the kinds of things that seem to develop during this period, characteristic of both black and white English. Then there are things that have developed in African American English during the 20th century. Best example of this is habitual be, they be doing this, the B plus ing that's familiar to most people. If you look, there were two kinds of invariant be, one that came from Will-Wood deletion and one that did not. And if you look at figure 13 here, you can see the expansion of invariant be that cannot be derived from Will-Wood deletion over the course of the 20th century, and especially after the 1920s, during World War II and later. You can see the expansion of that. At the same time that that's happening, you can see the expansion of that invariant be with habitual meaning. If you look at just those invariant be's that have an habitual sense, again, if you look at the 1940s and later, you see the rapid expansion of that. And then if you look at its occurrence before ing verbs, you see an even later occurrence there. So you can trace very clearly during the course of the 20th century, and especially after World War II, the development of habitual be plus ing. You see the development of be, it's narrowing semantically. In fact, I think I have this. First of all, you have the decline of invariant be from Will-Wood deletion, the expansion of invariant be that's not derived from Will-Wood deletion, the narrowing of the semantic scope, and then the restriction of its occurrence to positions before V plus ing. The Great Migration provides the social context for this to happen. Same thing is true of had plus past uses a simple past. Both of these are things that develop after the Great Migration. That provides the social context, the milieu during which that developed. So you can see some things developed clearly back during a period of slavery must have come from a source language. Other things that developed during the tenant system developed in both black and white speech. Some things that develop in African American vernacular in the 20th century. What happens with the reversal of the Great Migration? I'm going to come back to zero copula in just a minute. Well, quotative be like, and this comes from Trish's stuff, or this figure doesn't, but the rest of it does. The quotative be like is expanding in Texas speech just like it is everywhere else. It's also expanding in the speech of African Americans in the last couple of generations of people we interviewed in Springville, and you can see it here. The interesting thing about the expansion of quotative be like, when it's adopted in Springville, it's adopted in the vernacular of the, so people use quotative be like, but they use invariant be with quotative be like and zero copula with quotative be like. It's adapted into their copula system. So with the reversal of the Great Migration, you see forms coming in from other places, but still the maintenance of that system as well. Now I want to go back really quickly to, because I have about a minute left anyway, to zero copula. Zero copula, one of the oldest and most distinctive features of African American English, and it's been there forever, but it hasn't always been the same. And one of the things that Trish was able to document, and before and after World War II, there was a subtle change in the constraints on it. If you look at the blue bars here, and I want to go down to non-stative and stative adjectives. Adjectives, there was no distinction between stative and non-stative adjectives for most of the history of African American vernacular and zero copula. Sometime during the Great Migration, that began to change. Non-stative adjectives were treated more like verbs and gonna, and the stative adjectives pretty much remained the same. So you see a subtle shift in the constraints on zero copula over time. And our more recent work in Springville has documented even larger corpus of this. So even some things that had their origins at the beginning of African American English underwent subtle change during the Great Migration. A quick summary here. To understand African American English and the way it is right now, you have to understand its entire history, the evolution of its demographic context, and it's one of the most complex demographic contexts in the history of the U.S. Thank you very much. There are lots of good Springville slides so you can see at some point.
Yeah, that was what I was about to say. Let's look at those pictures of Springville. Don't tease us.
I like those pictures because there's one of me when I still have hair and it's all black. So, yeah, the person sitting on the porch there with the really black hair and with a head full of hair is me. But that's 1988 and a long time ago. So Trish took that picture. But you can see, if you wonder what again, tenant houses there, and the store, the country store, post office at the center of it, then you can see interactions in the store, and this is in East Texas, East Central Texas, yeah. East Central Texas, yeah. Yes?
I was grabbing the microphone, but I'll let Glenn go first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was surprised to hear earlier this morning about, I made a comment that there were extensive slave plantations in the eastern part of the Texas German area.
That's right.
Between the corridor that you described yesterday, is it I-35
Yes.
corridor?
Yes.
And Houston.
That's right.
That area. And since German doesn't have off-glides on its long vowels, A and O, if the slaves interacted with the German owners of those plantations and overseers in German, if they were learning German, this might have affected their acquisition of those glides you were talking about, so that more study of black English in that area might show an effect of the former German plantations there.
That's a good point. The only place that's true. The monophthongal A and O is pretty widespread in the recordings with former slaves. I think virtually all of them had the monophthongal A and O, regardless of where they were from. And to me, that was the most distinctive thing when I heard those tapes that I noticed.
Well, thanks very much, Guy. I wonder if you could go back to the slides. I think there was one on the Pin-Pen merger, and right next, the Pin-Pen merger slide, if you could go back to that. No, maybe it was copula. It's the one that shows a pretty early start to the changes. And, okay, what I'm saying is that those age group dates are dates of birth, right?
They're dates of birth.
So that's apparent time. So my question is, as you might imagine, what if some of those people from way back then have changed their grammars in the meantime, and so that those changes started really a little later, and the curve is a little steeper than dates of birth would show?
It's quite possible. I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. I mean, and until we started looking at I'll go to the quotative be like. I really never understood, and really had never thought about it until in your work, the lifespan changes. But when I saw this, I realized, well, it's pretty, and so that curve could be actually much steeper than, because that's all apparent time, and it's by date of birth. And if we had better real-time things, you probably could create a steeper, so I would not be surprised at all.
Thank you. I was wondering if there are linguistic studies on the black people from Mexico who ended up being in Texas, the US, after the Guadalupe Hidalgo treaty. I was wondering if there are studies on that.
I don't know of any. There may be, but nothing that I know of right off the top of my head. It'd be an interesting topic, though.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Another one here.
I actually have a question, well, basically directed to all the experts in the room, so everybody.
That's everybody but me.
And I'm certainly one of the novices here, as Sonia pointed out earlier, but has anyone ever really seriously taken into consideration the role of children? I mean, this is something Edgar addressed earlier, the interaction of white and black children. I mean, thinking about the origins and developments of these types of English and Creoles and Pidgins and everything. I mean, and then also, I mean, related but not being the same mechanisms of language acquisition, like from the language acquisition perspective, first language acquisition, but then also second language acquisition.
You know, on the role of children, I think people have I mean, certainly if you go back to that period of farm Tennessee where, I mean, it's pretty close interaction, but I grew up in completely segregated South. High schools were integrated when I started high school in 1965. It was perfectly okay when you were a kid to play with African-American kids who lived fairly close by. But we didn't have any interaction in churches, schools, or anything like that. So, yeah, sure there was influence. I mean, you know, I'm sure there was. I think much of what you think of Southern American English is really a joint creation there.
I was just thinking because there's this debate going on about children as the, well, initiators of language change and development. Yeah. And I mean, you have these super extreme positions, and the, well, generativists would maybe claim something like they are the locus of language change. So I know that this does not have to be true, of course, but I was just interested. Yeah.
I don't know, Edgar or John may have something far more intelligent to say than I do.
Thank you. Not that I know of, really. I mean, there are two things that come to my mind, and both are largely familiar, I guess. One is the claim that Creoles are the product of a first generation of children locally on a plantation, which has come to be disputed by today as I see it. And secondly, there is, of course, work on the acquisition of African-American English dialect, notably by Lisa Green and others. But both, I think, wouldn't be directed to the kind of historical considerations that we've been talking about here. So no, that's just a lacuna, a gap in research. On the other hand, I don't see where you'd get any reliable evidence from.
Okay, thank you so much. Join me in thanking Guy Bailey for his paper. Guy and Tricia are one of those people like Walt Wolfram, who was supposed to be a part of this panel, and then John Singler, who have done long-term research in an area they've committed to. And so the work that's coming out of that has been really fascinating. All right, so last in our panel is Sally Coco Mufwani, who will lead the discussion session. So he will make some remarks and then also open it up for questions for everyone else. I won't say more about Sally Coco because we've already said his name quite a bit, so you're all familiar with him already. So thank you for taking charge of the rest of the session.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this. There are so many different things. I will refrain from commenting on all of them, even most of them. The question about the name for African American English, Ebonics, African American language, I think I'll leave it to African American linguists. That's one thing. But the other thing is that I tend to pay more attention to the folk, the non-linguists, non-academics, when they react, for instance, saying, I have an accent, they speak American English. And something that I also learn in traveling with Americans in general abroad is that abroad, really the difference between speaking African American English and speaking white American English kind of collapses. Because abroad you realize that Americans are closer to each other linguistically than they think. And white Americans are closer to African Americans than they are, say, to white Caribbeans, or than they are to the British. And this is an important thing, and we owe a whole lot of this to the common history, especially regarding the South, the part that I think Guy Bailey and Edgar Schneider have contributed a lot to clarifying. Now, I'm grateful to John Singler for picking up on where I was either inaccurate or didn't articulate things clearly enough about the emergence of African American English and the notion of ethnolect. There should be no expectation about any language variety for homogeneity or uniformity. One of the first things you learn in doing evolutionary linguistics is the significance of variation. When I started my career at the University of Georgia, I had a phonetics exercise in class, and I asked students to transcribe the word hands. That's my pronunciation. And I saw more transcriptions of hands than I expected. Hands, 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 with D or without D. And then I became more curious. I asked for the transcription of clothes. And clothes with monophthongization or without monophthongization. That tells you a great deal about what Southern English is, what African American English is. And in the chapter that I wrote, the introductory chapter for Sonja's Lanehart's book, the question is, you really leave it to African Americans to tell you what African American English, because you cannot define it. The more you try to characterize it, the more elusive it becomes. And for instance, if I try to speak African American English with the features that we linguists associate with African American English, everybody will recognize me as a non-speaker of African American English. But if Jesse Jackson walks up in front of the pulpit and uses casually in passing a few features of African American English, he's an African American English speaker. So you figure it out. Okay. So I think what I also find particularly significant in the John Singler's discussion is the question about origins and evolution. And we find the answer actually in Guy Bailey's paper because it shows the features that may have been less significant statistically at some period, and at a later period they become more pronounced, or features that may have been more pronounced, they become less pronounced population-wise. And I learned a lesson I think in a paper that several years ago, Bill Kretschmar and Susan Tamasi published for words for dragonfly and thunder and so forth, how many synonyms you find in a population. So this is one respect in which linguistic features become similar to genetic features, genetic traits. They are there, some of them very latent. You just don't know what particular ecological factors are going to make them more conspicuous. And this is very interesting. So when you compare the Liberian population with the African American population, first we are dealing with the diverse origins of the settlers. And then we have to deal with the dynamics that obtained in the diaspora, in the new population. Same feature pool, but the balance of power among the features, the variance, changes. And even though we speak of a settler population, it's difficult to discount the impact that may have exerted on this diasporic variety from interacting with the local population one way or another. And one of the things I remember is that in 1997, we published a set of papers in a special symposium issue of World Englishes, and we were discussing the notion of continuum. And you shed a lot of light on how to interpret the Basilect. It's easy to tell what the Basilect is when you are dealing with African American English in the United States, and you construct an acrolect, and you can start deal with that continuum. When you get to Liberia, the non-settler indigenous people that are learning settler English, and how more diversion they are making it from everything, your notion of Basilect becomes different, and how you construct the continuum becomes different. And this is one place where you don't think about possible decreolization to account for the dimensions of the continuum. The gist of it is that there is just so much that we have to take into account when we are dealing with evolution. So I will stick to the distinction between origins and evolution, simply because a number of things can happen after a feature emerges in a particular language variety, and it's just a matter of following what life trajectories they take once they emerge. I want to remind you of the work of Walter Brush, published in 1981, Black English in the Media. And particularly interesting there is characterizations of the speech of slaves, runaway slaves, because they are reported in the newspaper. And you see, so-and-so was born in Africa, arrived here 6 months ago, speaks English terribly. XYZ was born on this plantation, speaks English pretty good, or something like that, and things of the sort. And you find some sort of correlation between what is considered acceptable English among Creole slaves and what is considered acceptable English or non-acceptable English among the Bozal slaves. And we get quite a picture of the heterogeneity, linguistic heterogeneity of the slave population, which actually makes it futile to me to assume that everybody that was slave started with some sort of Basilek in the population, or every population started with a Basilek, and then things would become more and more closer to the target language. What we get is actually what Bill Labov in 1986 paper on the divergence of African American English made us so clear, and then they rejoined it by Bailey and other people, that there is actually more and more divergence. And the picture that history actually suggests, if we are true to history, is like Chaudenson put it, from closer approximations of the colonial language to more and more divergent approximations of the divergence. That is what we have called restructuring in Creole studies. But the challenge is, what is the colonial variety? You know, some of us try to speak of coineization. Coineization is another kind of idealization. Yes, there is some sort of coineization, but coineization never eradicated variation within the population. So it depends now on who interacts with whom, how regularly, how good they are as language learners. We are not equally competent as language learners. It's something we have to acknowledge, because learning a language is also like learning cultural patterns in a population. If you have seen people that make faux pas culturally, and they are indigenous to the population, think also of some native speakers that are not all equally competent in the language. Maybe this is a problem with linguistics in constructing the notion of native competence and so forth. But when we factor in variation, then we can deal with a number of these issues that we have been wrestling with. And as I said earlier this morning, I think that Creoles and varieties such as African American English, on which we have focused so much, are prompting us loud and clear to re-examine a number of things in the bigger picture. Okay, and the Edgar highlighted what we can learn from the narratives, slave narratives. We have focused so far on structural features. It's interesting to see what they are talking about and whether those narratives can really inform us about some of the external ecological conditions that influence the emergence of these particular varieties. And there are many things. Let me just talk about the significance of periodization in what Guy Bailey said. The features like pen-pin merger, or the habitual BVING, or the distribution of the copula, why these features didn't all become so conspicuous at the same time. I mean, the other thing here, the fact that a feature becomes conspicuous at a particular time doesn't mean that that is when it emerged or when it really became a significant part of the grammar of that particular population. And these are the kinds of things that we have to sort out, and it's consistent with, again, origin and evolution. And also, the point about great migration, that is really very helpful. And it is in that context that I said African American English was invented by white northerners as an ethnolet. Because people are living a South that is becoming increasingly segregated and increasingly hostile to former slaves. And they go to the North, what happens? They are boxed, to put it more or less like that, into ghettos. And there they have to develop their own separate cultures, separate linguistic practices. And I think a whole lot of the divergence that we are becoming interested in takes place in this particular context, where in the North, African Americans can work together with white Americans, but don't socialize together with white Americans. And this is particularly significant. So significant that I believe it explains something else that Bill Labov pointed out about the northern cities vowel shift. I keep confusing with the great vowel shift. The northern cities vowel shift. Why is it that only white Americans and probably just urban middle class white Americans are participating in this, but not African Americans? Well, there are African Americans that middle class working with white Americans and so forth, but where do they socialize? Do they socialize together and so forth? In my history in Chicago, you know, you work together, but you don't go and eat together, you don't go and drink together and so forth. So there is, and I think it's that social life that fashions a whole lot of the features that we characterize as African American English and so forth, rather than the fact of finding yourselves together in an office, and you are interacting in a non-vernacular variety in the office, but you socialize in a vernacular variety. Well, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
There's two areas of research in African American English which have not been mentioned here, which are on the periphery, and I wonder if members of the panel have something to say about them. One of them is that it's been well documented that the relationship in the Sea Island areas between the upper class and Gullah dialect resulted in a transformation of the white dialect among the children growing up. But I haven't seen any discussion of this relationship between nursemaids and children outside of the Sea Island area. One might think, though, that some of the relationships that were suggested here between whites and blacks were developed on that basis outside of the Sea Islands. And the other question regarding the definition of African American English also relates to middle class. In our research on the development of various tense and aspect markers, it has been suggested that African American English has a very broad base on a perceptual side, that middle class African Americans have at least a passive knowledge of the tense and aspect developments which whites do not have. And I was wondering if you know of any research which looks into the limits of the sort of development that Arthur Spears talked about, where camouflaged uses of tense and aspect patterns are widespread in the middle class area, even if they don't use the same features productively in speech production.
Actually, I don't know of any research on either one of those. my colleagues might, but I guess Tracy Weldon's done stuff on some of the middle class speech, but I don't know. You know, the other thing about Charleston is so interesting. A lot of the settlement of both African American from slaves and whites was from the Caribbean. Charleston was unlike part of the rest of this. I think Barbados in particular was a source of settlement from Charleston. It's different in a lot of ways from the rest of the South. Both of those are interesting topics. I don't know much about them.
Can't say a word on the second one of these issues. There is something on the first one. There is evidence, which is also based on the ex-slave narratives, that the southern third, roughly, of South Carolina showed a continuum of black-white relationships in terms of demographic proportions. The further south you go, the stronger the proportion of African Americans was. And there are some linguistic traces of that. Alex Couch and myself had a paper a long time ago, which is published in 2000 in a volume which is called Degrees of Restructuring in Creole Languages in the Yellow series by Benjamins. And I think it shows roughly that there is a sort of continuum relationship that extends beyond the Sea Islands into the mainland, but basically only in the state of South Carolina, which had the highest proportion of African Americans anyhow.
Well, the traditional distinction between Southern English, New England English, and the middle part?
Middle Atlantic.
Middle Atlantic. When you get to the coast, it doesn't hold anymore, because there is just a particular variety in coastal South Carolina and Georgia that applies to both white and black residents, the people that are indigenous to the area. And those varieties don't fit in the traditional Southern English variety. And they show similarities to the Caribbean, but there's just similarities in terms of family resemblance and similarities to the Bahamas. But then Bahamas, people will tell you, is people that left the South and went to the Bahamas. I don't remember who said it earlier this morning. If you take people, I think it was John, people from similar backgrounds, and you put them in different settings, and the context settings are similar, you are going to find quite a number of similarities. But that's it. They are just similarities, and this is, I think, where the Creolist hypothesis went wrong, because once you start focusing on details, you find differences. Gala has a schwa that no Caribbean variety has. Gala has a bilabial fricative, where you are going to find B in Caribbean varieties. And when you follow things, you are going to find similar differences. They just tell you the context settings were not quite identical.
This is sort of going with the discussion and not necessarily that close to Bill's original questions. But for Georgia, especially southeastern Georgia, Simonique Moody's 2011 dissertation looks at the relationship of Gullah to African American vernacular English there. And there is a geographical component in that people who live in coastal counties, even in speaking show more Gullah influence than people further in. But it's important for showing how the two varieties interact.
When you read the work of Zora Neale Hurston, that's where you are confronted with the difficulty. Because Zora Neale Hurston, although she came from the interior, she spent time in Charleston. And I read The Eyes Were Watching God. You find a combination of Gullah features with features that you would find in African American English. So, but the continuum is really, is very real. When you travel in that area and you stop here and there and so forth, it's very difficult to tell where Gullah starts and African American English ends, or the other way around, where Gullah ends and African American. But the reality is that boundaries are constructed by us. The boundaries are not as real as we can hypothesize them.
So, Sally, in that last statement, that I wanted for clarification, because and maybe it's just the way that I've seen it and talked about it, African American language is sort of an umbrella term for all of these other varieties, of which Gullah would be a part, because they're spoken by people of African descent in America, right? So it's not that they're a separate thing, they're different sides of a coin, so to speak, right? So in the same way we're talking about standard African American language or African American standard language or middle class, or we have Nicole Holiday now looking at biracial, black, white, biracial children's, not children's, but a young adult language, that those are all just sort of varieties of this larger term, because they all are various representations of what it means to be African American in this country, and we know how complex that is and how complex it keeps growing.
That is the position that I have assumed in at least 2 publications, including the one in the volume that you edited, African American English as an umbrella term, and AVE for the variety in the hinterlands, and Gullah for the variety on the coast, bearing in mind that Gullah is the term that we linguists prefer. While I was doing field work, a question I often receive was, why are you interested in the way we speak? You speak English with an accent. We speak English with an accent. They know much more linguistics than we do, I think. And it's, very clear that for them it's English, it's not Creole. They are not even familiar with the term Creole. And so it's one more reason why we should re-examine our positions, as I was exhorting us to do this morning.
If I could just throw in one anecdotal thing. When one of the sea islands off the coast of Georgia is Sapelo Island, and you can only go there if you have a guide. And the guide, when I went, was a young Gullah man who had grown, or Geechee, who had grown up on the island, but had spent some time in a Florida city. And in talking to the 4 of us, he used Gullah auxiliaries like duh and the like, sort of a good Gullah system, and the be-like quotative. So you see this kind of thing, this kind of mixture. As a linguist, I, of course, was puzzled, to say the least. But it does reflect the kind of mixture that goes on. There, just a little. Really come.
All right, so thank you so much for coming this morning, and now we're into the afternoon. I appreciate all of our panelists and guests, Sally Coco Mafweni, John Singler, Edgar Schneider, and Guy Bailey. Please join me in thanking them.
When I was listening to your paper,